hearing suite. May we have your attention for some brief housekeeping announcements. Waverley Gates has a fire alarm test every Tuesday at 10 AM. If the alarm sounds at any other time, please make your way out the fire exit at the back left corner of the hearing room and down the staircase to your right, which will exit onto Colton Road, the muster point for the inquiry. Please follow these instructions unless advised otherwise by a fire marshal, and if in doubt, follow the green emergency exit signs. Do take a moment to familiarise yourself with our hearing suite etiquette. This can be found on the hearing suite TV screens now. There is a cafe on the ground floor selling hot drinks and snacks, but we kindly request that you only consume water in the hearing suite. You can help yourself to water in glasses, which you can find in the kitchen next to our reception desk. Inquiry staff are wearing orange lanyards. Please approach them if you require assistance. Please ensure that your phones, laptops and any electronic devices are on silent mode. Device screens may be captured on the broadcast during wide shots of the hearing suite. All attendees are kindly asked to stand when the inquiry chair enters and leaves the hearing room. A member of the inquiry team will inform you when to stand. Please remain at your seats until the chair and witnesses have left the room. Thank you for your attention. The hearing will start in a few moments.
Good morning, my lord.
Good morning, Mr. Turner. Now, you have one witness for us this morning, I believe.
I do, my lord. We have Ms. Satwat Rehman from the One Parent Family Scotland.
Very good. Good morning, Ms. Satwan.
Morning.
Right, Mr. Turner will have some questions for you. I'll just ask him to start those right now. On you go, Mr. Turner.
Thank you, my lord. Good morning, Ms. Rehman.
Morning.
First of all, could I just remind you that this morning's hearing will be transcribed? If you could try and speak slowly and clearly, that will help our stenographer, and I shall try and do the same. Could I ask you first of all to state your full name?
Satwat Rehman.
Thank you. And could you tell his lordship what your current position is?
I'm the Chief Executive of a charity called One Parent Family Scotland.
Thank you. And how long have you held that position?
Since January 2011.
Thank you. You've provided a written statement to the inquiry, is that correct?
I have, yes.
Thank you. My lord, for your reference, that is reference SCI WT 0144 number 1. Ms. Rahman, everything in that statement, and indeed any other documents which One Parent Family Scotland have provided to the inquiry, will be taken fully into account. We only have an hour this morning, so we may not get to everything that you've told the inquiry, but his lordship will consider the full extent of your evidence in due course. To begin, I'd like to ask you some questions about One Parent Family Scotland. First of all, does it have a shortened acronym?
OPFS.
Thank you. And Could you tell us what kind of organisation it is, when it was established, its constitution, etc.?
Sure thing. We were established 80 years ago. This is our 80th anniversary year. We're a charity registered with Oscar. We're also a company limited by guarantee. We provide a range of services for single-parent families across Scotland, face-to-face in certain areas like Glasgow, the Lanarkshires, Falkirk, Edinburgh and Dundee, and Scotland-wide services through a phone line, a website, web chat and other media channels.
Thank you.
And we can provide all sorts of support.
That's great. And does the organisation have any specific aims or priorities?
Alleviating poverty, supporting one-parent families to achieve their potential, ensuring that we're able to address the specific issues that impact on families where there's only one adult. And in particular, we've got a strong focus on providing support with employment, debt, money advice, children, education, schooling, and then we use all that evidence to influence policy and practice.
Thank you. The clue's perhaps in the name, so far as it's called one-parent families. Yeah. Could you describe for his lordship, when you think of one-parent families, what you actually mean by that, or the kinds of groups that OPFS work with? 92%
of single parents are women. So we primarily work with households headed by a single adult who is a woman. The risk of poverty is almost twice as high in single-parent families than in couple families. And that's partly because, as a society, we haven't yet established services and ways of working which recognise that we've got a diversity of family types. I mean, 25% of families with children are headed by a single parent in Scotland. So you're talking about a very large minority.
Thank you. You've mentioned there some of the demographic instances. Could you perhaps tell us about the age of the types of families you work with?
Absolutely. We work with, like I said, single-parent families, and there are assumptions that they tend to be young mothers, but actually only 2% of single parents are teenage mothers. The vast majority are aged 35 plus, having been in a relationship prior to becoming a single parent.
Thank you. And in terms of employment, what sort of employment situations do they tend to be in?
Much higher levels of unemployment among single-parent families. Many of the families who we work with will be in entry-level work, being able to only work limited hours due to there being a lack of flexible childcare. So often their earning power is very restricted, but their outgoings are not much less, if any less, than it would be in a two-parent household. So that's where the risk of poverty, insecure work comes in, and I think would have played a major part in some of the deepening of poverty that we saw happen over the past few years.
Thank you. Are there any other factors that come into play in respect of single parents?
You will find that there are more single-parent households affected by disability, either the parent or the child. And often when we work with families, we find out that that's been one of the reasons for the breakdown. There's been the additional pressures of parenting or caring for someone who's got additional needs or a disability. Greater likelihood of living in some of the areas with the highest levels of deprivation in Scotland. Issues with housing, adequate housing, and increasingly in some parts of Scotland, we're seeing more single-parent families in temporary accommodation. So a range of issues which impact on capacity and resilience.
Thank you. You've mentioned a great number of factors there. Do the individuals that you deal with, that the organisation are in contact with, do they tend to be fall into one or more of these categories, if you like?
There are 6 priority family groups in Scotland's Child Poverty Act, single parents being one of them, families affected by disability being another, larger families, families with young children, ethnic minority families, and young parents. And when doing an analysis of those figures that the Scottish Government had produced, you saw that there were very few single parents who only fell within the single parent category. So what you've got are intersecting inequalities coming into play for many single parent families.
Thank you. You've described, in terms of the families being female-led, and I understand from when you're saying that, in the majority of cases we're talking about parents where the children are living with that led family. Is that the only group that you work with, or do you work with parents who are not living with necessarily with their children all the time?
We will provide support to the other parent, for want of a better phrase, if need be. We have had work in the past where we've worked specifically with dads, and we integrate the work now with single dads into our work with single parents. So basically, to be a single parent, you don't have to be the biological mother. You know, some of the families we support are kinship carers who have ended up with sole care of their child's children, for example. So the definition can be broad. And in more recent times, as a result of the crisis in Ukraine, we've had many people who've come to Scotland who are learning to parent alone for the first time. And so we've provided specific support to them as well.
Thank you. We're here today to discuss the pandemic primarily, and to discuss the impacts of the pandemic on one-parent families, or indeed anyone that you support. I'd like to talk to you now about the kinds of impacts that you and the organisation observed. I wonder if you could tell us, perhaps, what impacts did you observe during the pandemic?
I'm trying to think how I can summarise this, because basically there was an impact on every aspect of life, I would say, as a result of the pandemic, intensified for single-parent families, because some of the very early inquiries we received from single-parent families was, what happens to my children if I become ill? Right? So there was that real fear of, if I'm the adult in the house with the children and something happens to me, what's going to become of my children? Particularly intense in the early days of the pandemic, I'd say, when none of us really knew what it was, how it was spread, and what the mortality rate was going to be. So huge insecurity, anxiety, and fear about what it would mean for their children, first and foremost, I would say. A sense of, I would say, dread in terms of how they were going to manage everything in the households when we began to lock down, because a lot of what was coming out at the time in terms of how we're meant to manage this as individuals and within households didn't differentiate between different types of households. So I think that was a major impact that we saw.
When, just pause there for a moment, lockdown is obviously one of the major things that happened during the pandemic, and it happened obviously very early on during the pandemic. Could you describe for His Lordship what the experience would have been for a single parent during lockdown?
I can. I'm going to make a few assumptions here, though, because otherwise I'd be here all day trying to describe different experiences. So if we're talking about a single parent who's got, say, 3 children, one at nursery, one at primary, one at secondary, who could be working part-time prior to the lockdowns, and there'd be an expectation that they'd continue to be able to work somehow from home, what you saw was an intense build-up of pressure in the home as a result of trying to manage work for yourself, the emotions and the insecurities of your children, concerns about income, where the income was going to be coming from, would it be maintained? For many parents, this might have been the first time they'd had to apply for universal credit, for example, if they weren't in receipt before. As we know, there were delays in benefits. There's a 5-week delay built into universal credit from the start. So how am I going to feed my children? And then on top of that, it's how am I going to support them with their schooling, which was a major issue for many of the families we worked with in terms of space, in terms of capacity, and access to the internet and to have the right equipment at home. One console, one tablet wasn't going to cut it for many of the families that we worked with. And then there's the aspect of skills and one's own concerns about literacy, numeracy, and whether they'd be equipped to be able to support their children.
Thank you. In your statement, Ms. Rehman, you mentioned questions of isolation. Mm-hmm. Could you tell His Lordship about that?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think it was an isolating time for pretty much all of us, I would say, but exacerbated for single parents because there was no other adult in the house with whom to discuss, share concerns, problem solve. Think about how they were going to get out, for example, to the shops at the time when it was one person per household was the requirement for going shopping. And there we did hear of families who'd been asked to leave their children outside supermarkets or had been sent out of supermarkets if they'd entered with their children because it was one person per household. And yet there was nowhere to leave the children, no one. Those sorts of, I suppose, peer support and social networks, which you might have through nursery, through school, through bumping into people on the streets, from having a neighbour who could step in and sit with your children while you went out, all that disappeared. And that's why we begin to see a real impact on the mental health and well-being of many of the families that we supported.
Thank you. You mentioned support for education and the difficult time that people had and the use of devices and the like. Were there any other concerns that you noted regarding use of electronic devices, for example?
Connectivity, I would say, was one of the big issues for many of the families that we worked with. There wasn't necessarily the internet that they needed. Many might have pay-as-you-go phones with very limited data deals because they're essential for everything that families have to do, including applying for their benefits. There were concerns about digital literacy for many of the families. And there were tensions which arose in the house if there weren't enough devices and they were trying to support all the children with access to education. And we heard of cases where parents just felt that the stresses it was placing on a very confined situation where you were all in the house together all the time were too great, and that for the health and well-being of themselves and their children, some decided they weren't going to try to add pressure onto children through this digital learning at all times. They would do it as and when they could, but they certainly couldn't do it in a structured way that was being expected.
It's maybe implicit from what you've said there, but does that mean there were times where children were not getting the education that they would have otherwise?
I would say so, yes. Yes. There was one example where a parent did contact the school and arranged for physical handouts and workbooks to be sent home because it was much easier for her to use those with her children than it was to try to do it on a digital device where really you can only focus on one child at a time.
You've mentioned the pressures that single parents were feeling. You've mentioned the family dynamics in terms of adding to those pressures. Were there other family dynamic situations that would have impacted on some people's experience during that time as well?
There were Yes, I would say there were. Many were concerned about others who they might have had some caring responsibility for. They were concerned about those who were in care homes. They were hearing lots of different things from different people at the time about what was going on, which was adding to a sense of confusion amongst families. So there was a range of concerns that they would have had. And if they had a child with additional needs or a disability, there was the pressures as a result of services not being able to come in and support that might have offered caring and respite before that. So all these added pressures.
We've talked about non-resident parents, if
Yes.
I can put it that way, and I take it from that some of the families that you support may have a parent in the home and a parent
That's right.
out with the home. Did that dynamic raise any?
It did.
Situations?
It raised a number of concerns, and there was a lot of confusion at the very beginning about whether or not the children would be able to spend time with the non-resident parent or not. That, in some cases, created tensions between the two parents. And one of the things that we heard through parents and through the staff and the support that they give to parents, that in some cases that did lead to there being tensions and coercion and financial abuse and coercion in families. Well, if I'm not getting them, you're not getting the money, that type of thing. So it added a whole degree of pressure to families where there might have been arrangements that worked fairly well up until then, and then we ended up in this intense situation where one parent often couldn't see their children, but that doesn't mean that they weren't sitting with all those concerns, anxieties and worries, and how that manifests itself in the relationship with the parent with care often was very difficult, and many of the parents we worked with who experienced that regarded it as a continuation of abuse.
You've mentioned there abuse, and in particular you were talking about coercion and financial abuse. In terms of that term more generally, though, did you, or was it reported to OPFS, any other kinds of abuse in those situations?
What do you mean by abuse?
Well, I'm asking the question, I suppose,
Okay.
in any context, in any meaning.
They were the main ways.
You mentioned very specifically financial abuse and coercion,
control.
but was there other kinds of abuse?
They were the main
or
ways.
otherwise?
They were the main ways. I think the physical one we didn't hear so much about because there wasn't necessarily physical contact, but that doesn't mean there wasn't emotional abuse as a result of that. You know, playing on people's anxieties. And one of the biggest anxieties amongst the families we support was poverty, and increasing poverty as costs were increasing in the household with all the children there and you being in all the time, but income not increasing in any way.
Thank you. We all know that we moved out of lockdown.
Yes.
Eventually. People started to return to work. Did that raise any particular concerns for one-parent families in terms of either their children or indeed in respect of their work?
A number of concerns, I would say. Whilst there was an expectation that we would return to work, there were a number of developments which had been delayed, understandably, as a result of the lockdowns and the pandemic. And one of those was the expansion of early learning and childcare hours. And childcare is absolutely critical to single-parent families in relation to work because there is no second adult to share the childcare with. So I think some of those lags and delays in expansions and developments that would have supported single parents on that return to work weren't there. They weren't regarded in many cases as one of the priority groups for support and priority for support. And that was something which, again, meant that there were lags in their prioritisation for access to services and support, which would enable those of them who did work to return to work.
Do you know of any examples where parents have requested access for their children to schools, either hubs or otherwise, and not been able to do that?
We had a couple of examples of that that came up for slightly different reasons. And there were some single parents who contacted us who were key workers, who would have been regarded as key workers, fit the definition, and therefore would have been prioritised for support for the childcare hubs and learning hubs. But given the speed with which everything was being done, quality assurance didn't happen in the same way for some of those application processes. So we had cases of single parents contacting us to say, I'm doing the form, completing the form in order to be able to get support for my child because I'm a key worker. On the form it asks if your partner is a key worker. I don't have a partner, but unless I tick a box, it's not letting me submit the form. If I tick the box saying no, then I'm not eligible for the support. You know, so some very simple solutions in those cases, and that, you know, that thing about working together to produce forms, to look at application processes, to look at eligibility, I think would have made it a lot easier for families that we work with.
Just to be clear for His Lordship, so effectively the position of the single parent family was not even an option in terms of that form?
No, on those forms there was no option to say that there was no partner. You parented alone and you were a key worker. Yeah.
Thank you. We've talked about the effect on parents predominantly in terms of their experience. Are you able to tell His Lordship what the experience was for children in those circumstances?
I can tell you that through what we heard from parents and through the workers that were supporting the parents and the children. Well, obviously there was limited in some cases and intermittent access to their learning. That was a big one. There were children who were getting very anxious about what if something happens to my mum, right? So they were carrying that fear of what will happen to us if something happens to my mum. We saw increases in levels of anxiety. And one of the big issues that still families talk to us about is the impact on the mental health and well-being of children as a result of being so isolated during that time, and as a result of the pressures they were also seeing their parents under during that time. I do think also for many, the lack of opportunity to engage socially, say, for example, through play schemes, after-school clubs, being able to take part in activities, physical activity, was a major impact. Many of the families that we work with will tend to live in areas where there's not easy or immediate access to good green spaces. You know, some of us are privileged in that respect. We had that around us. Many of the families we worked with didn't. So there was the impact on physical health, as well as mental health and emotional health for the families we worked with. For some of the children who might have found learning in school difficult anyway, engaging with that learning added tension into the family situation. And actually, we're not all specialist teachers. You know, if you'd had additional support for learning support in school for your child, if your child was getting specialist support in some other way, all that went. You could not possibly fulfill all those roles as a parent, and therefore you were concerned about how your child was suffering. So I'd say it was physical, mental, emotional. For some children, I think what we heard was it made going back to school much more difficult if they'd already found it a challenge to be in school. And but then, you know, on the other hand, we heard about from some families where there were those daily battles to try and get your children into school. It actually alleviated tension. You know, so again, a mixed bag, but I'd say on the whole negative.
Thank you. The inquiry's reporting period runs for the 3 years, 2020 to 2022. His Lordship will predominantly be reporting on the decisions that were taken during that period. His Lordship is obviously mindful that the effects of those decisions may run on
Absolutely.
and may continue. In your experience, is that the case in respect of the impacts that were observed by one-parent families?
I would say so. I would say that what we've had for one-parent families was the impact of austerity, followed by the impact of the pandemic, going straight into a cost of living crisis. I think it's very difficult to separate those out. But I mean, certainly the pandemic had an impact on mental health, on welfare, on access to income, you know, exacerbated the situation for the families that we work with who live in poverty and experience poverty. And then it wasn't like there was any respite from there. It wasn't like things picked up in a way which recognised what some of those long-term impacts will be on families and communities. And I honestly think we're still seeing the impact of them now, particularly on the mental health and well-being of children and young people in the families that we work with, and more widely. And there's also that sense of things being paused. You know, we had families where young people might have been in apprenticeships and those were terminated during the pandemic. And so you're having to start again in some cases. So, you know, it's one of those ironic situations where you hear about some sections of society having increased wealth, savings, etc. during the pandemic because they made savings in household costs. And then you have the other situation of the families we worked with, many of whom didn't have enough to live on to begin with, but suddenly had additional costs as a result of the pandemic, where it's exacerbated inequality and poverty.
You perhaps just answered my question, but in terms of the effect, the overall effect in terms of financial position, has it exacerbated the position in terms of the people that you've been supporting?
Absolutely. I would say so. Yep. I mean, like I said, costs increased. Measures to address those lagged behind the experience. You know, I speak in my statement about working with others to promote a cash-first approach, and we did get to a cash-first approach eventually, but initially it was looking to, you know, there was a scattergun approach to how we provided additional support to families. Some families were given vouchers or cards for certain supermarkets. Actually, you don't want families travelling during a pandemic halfway across town to be able to buy what they need. Other places looked at providing food in kind as opposed to cash. But actually, the thing that worked best and the approach we got to was one of recognising that providing cash to families to be able to meet their own needs in the way that best suits them was the ideal solution.
Thank you. I was going to come on to it later, but because
Sorry.
you've not at all, no, not at all. Because you've mentioned it, could I just ask you about the vouchers? Were there any other concerns regarding the use of vouchers in terms of emotionally, I suppose I might put it, in terms of people's use of vouchers as opposed to being able to spend cash?
It creates a stigma. It creates an additional stigma. It limits choice and it others people. And I think they're some of the things that we really need to guard against should we ever find ourselves in this situation again. You know, there was also the concerns about where some of those vouchers or cards were being given for in some areas, where there might not be the same access to fresh food, you know, better quality food, etc. So I think there was a series of attitudes in some areas, which was almost like we can't trust poor people with money, you know, and that created additional pressures for those families, and was also a false assumption to begin with. All the evidence will show that actually, if you give, you know, a mother money, she spends it on her children.
Thank you. we mentioned, or you mentioned, I should say, the intersection between different groups and how that affects. In terms of the experience during the pandemic for one-parent families, did you observe, as you might expect in the generality, those exacerbations from the intersectional nature of factors?
Yes, we did. We definitely saw that, particularly in relation to disability and caring, I would say, where you had, child caring responsibilities, but on top of that, additional caring responsibilities for a child who might have additional needs, for example. Maybe a child who needed more space than you were able to provide in your home, and the tensions that could cause within the family. I think there were particular issues for racially minoritized families. We provide quite a lot of support to migrant families, single-parent families in some parts of Scotland, like, for example, Glasgow and Edinburgh. And there was a lot of assumptions being made at that time about the nature of the virus, who it targeted, and why. And that led to speculations in the media and on social media, for example, that this was a virus that was racialized. It targeted certain racial groups more than others. Whereas actually what it was that people from racially minoritized communities have greater levels of poverty, higher levels of overcrowding, are more likely to work in frontline caring services within social care, etc., so are more exposed to the virus, as opposed to there being something intrinsic to the composition of the virus, which meant it targeted certain groups more than others.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'd like to ask you now about mitigation of the impacts, I suppose, during the pandemic, or indeed some of the guidance that was put in place at that time. Picking up what you were saying about the application forms and the absence of one-parent families consideration there, could I ask a general question in that regard? Do you feel that one-parent families were taken into account in terms of the strategic response by the Scottish Government?
No, they were an afterthought. Yeah.
You said they were an afterthought. Do you feel that they were thought about after?
Yes, they were thought about later in the process, I would say, as we were identifying issues. We gathered evidence in real time on a daily basis through the phone lines, through the web chat, and through the fact that via WhatsApp groups and other methods, we were continuing to support families. So as soon as we would hear about an issue, like, for example, the application form, we would feed it up to our contacts within, for example, certain directorates within the Scottish Government to identify the issues. When we heard of single-parent families being turned away from supermarkets or being asked to leave supermarkets, for example, we worked with other children and families organisations, including the Children and Young People's Commissioner's Office, to raise that as a specific concern, and wrote a letter to all supermarket chief executives to highlight it as an issue, but also made sure that those who were advising those in charge of the government were made aware of it. And it did result in, as part of the daily briefings, the First Minister specifically mentioning that one-parent families should be allowed to take their children into supermarkets. So that's what I mean by an afterthought. It feels like what we did was think about what would suit the majority of people, as opposed to thinking about those who are most vulnerable or are most likely to find this difficult, and working out from there in terms of our response.
Thank you. Could I perhaps just ask you about some specific examples of, in particular, some of the guidance and some of the regulation that were put in place? You talk in your statement about, I think, what is commonly referred to as bubbling.
Yes.
Could you tell us, Lordship, about that?
Yes, I think that was one of the best things that could have happened in a way for one-parent families who were able to pair up either with the non-resident parent, for example, if they lived close by, or began to develop some of that, those contacts again with people they had in their local or social network, and provide support, respite and opportunities to be able to socialise again for them and their children. So I think that was one of the things that was hugely beneficial, and I would say probably more so for one-parent families than for other family types in that situation, because it addressed some of the isolation and provided an outlet for some of the tensions that we all felt being stuck in the house 24/7 with the same people.
You've mentioned that you were feeding back to government through your various conduits, and you've mentioned some of the positive things that came out of that. In general, did you feel that the information that you were feeding back to government was being taken into account in terms of subsequent decision making?
In some cases, yes. It's hard to say that it was taken into account across the board, and we saw, but you know, we did begin to see a change, like for example, in not just at Scottish Government level, but at local level, single-parent families being regarded then as one of the priorities of required support because of the specific conditions they were in. We did see a move towards providing, you know, developing a cash-first approach to supporting families, but that came over time. It didn't happen automatically. We began to see efforts being made to look at how we could prioritise who received state-supported digital devices and connectivity. But actually that came over a period of time. What we found ourselves doing as an organisation is acting as a stopgap in those situations for the families we worked with. So as well as negotiating and bringing in money we could provide directly to single parents who needed it, as well as negotiating donations of handsets, tablets, MiFi devices, SIM cards with data from our own mobile phone provider within my organisation, you know, we were doing all that because nothing was happening for those families. And I understand partly that's because it's much easier as a smaller organisation to pivot and to change what we do and how we do it. We're not a statutory organisation. We're not governed by a series of rules and regulations in the same way. We've got different ones through OSCR and being a charity. But, you know, primarily we can pivot and do what's needed to support families. It takes government agencies and departments a lot longer to be able to do that. And that's where we saw the real gaps in provision for families. I do think that slowly over time, some of those became state responses, as they should have been from the beginning, because I think what we did, in a way, was create a very crowded landscape of lots of us trying to do little things for specific groups of families, when actually what we wanted was regularity of income, security of income, predictability. I'm getting this much at this time, as opposed to trying to put together a sort of patchwork of different types of supports for families.
Thank you. You've mentioned there some of the things you were doing in terms of service delivery during the pandemic. Perhaps I could just ask you about the service delivery of OPFS during the pandemic. First of all, could you give his lordship an idea about the numbers of people that you were helping during the pandemic in terms of in comparison to what you might have been helping before?
I hope that's in my statement.
Well, very broadly.
Roughly, prior to the pandemic, I'd say we were working with about 7,000 families. That doubled during the pandemic in terms of the support that was required and the support we provided. A lot of that was through the grants and the in-kind tech support that we offered. Part of it was, I think, just fortuitous that we'd developed a new website in February 2020, which had a web chat function, which we hadn't had prior to that. And we thought we'd go into a nice, gentle, soft launch and build up demand through web chat. Actually, it went through the roof from the very beginning of the pandemic, because there was so many issues and so many concerns and so much insecurity and lack of information at that time for families that they were just using whatever means they could. So I think, and it was the first time ever as an organisation that we became a grant giver. We're a service provider in the main. What we offer is support and practical advice. What we ended up also becoming was a conduit for providing financial support to single-parent families, be that through money we received from trusts and foundations, or from later on for winter payments for the Scottish Government.
Thank you. You've mentioned there the huge number of additional people that you were contacting. In terms of how you get involved with one-parent families ordinarily, leave the pandemic aside, but ordinarily, do those come to you by referral or are they self-referred?
It's both. They can come through referral from other agencies and organisations we work with. We're very well networked in all the local areas where we offer services. It can come through the helpline. It can come through web chat, self-referral, but also word of mouth. Word of mouth has always been a big way for us in terms of local services. Where a single parent's received support and has been happy with it, they'll go and speak to others about it, who will then get in touch with us.
Thank you. In terms of delivery of support during the pandemic, you've obviously mentioned the helpline was still active. You've mentioned the online offering in terms of web chat and the like. Were there any other online services that you were providing at that time?
We were trying to do as much as we could online once we'd made sure that people had access to the equipment and the connectivity if they hadn't before. So opportunities for online group meetings in a way to address some of those issues of isolation and for parents to be able to get peer support. We were trying to continue with some of the services that we'd provide around employability skills. But we also then had to write, develop, deliver courses online to support families to learn how to use the equipment and the connectivity, to support them with the many different platforms that were being used for learning for children at the time, and also to provide, I suppose, that same support we would have provided in person had we been able to, if they were having to apply for benefits, if they were having to, look at how they communicated with the non-resident parent, etc. And then, like I said, we used WhatsApp groups, and we internally within the organisation, to try to support staff, we set up informal channels through Slack where they could, during their tea break, chat to somebody else if they'd had a particularly difficult call or something.
Just because we haven't heard about it in this session yet, could you just explain what Slack is for His Lordship?
Oh, sorry. Slack is a platform where you can set up different channels. So we had it organisation-wide, and each team had a channel so they could communicate and plan and organise their work. And then we had a general channel where I think we were probably putting daily guidance updates for all staff. And then we had something called OPFS Chatter, which would be the equivalent of having a chat with somebody if you were having a coffee or during your lunch break. Again, that was one to address some of the isolation staff might have been feeling at the time. Some of the pressures where you no longer have the opportunity to debrief in person with somebody after you might have gone through a particularly difficult support session. And so it was a protective measure for the staff that we worked with, many of whom were being deeply affected by what they were hearing from the families we were supporting, at the same time as carrying all those concerns and anxieties about their own families and their wider family situation. And so it was one of the ways we tried to address vicarious trauma, in a way, secondary trauma, for the staff at what was probably one of the most insecure times that we've ever experienced.
You mentioned their staff, and I have a few questions about staff, but perhaps I could just take us back a step.
Sorry.
No, not at all. It's we can always jump around. That's fine. In terms of the staff, we obviously have a situation where lockdown was instructed on the 23rd of March, but if I could take us back before that, could you tell His Lordship what was happening in OPFS in terms of preparation, if I might, if there was any preparation in advance of that lockdown, and any decisions that were taken by OPFS for its staff before the lockdown on the 23rd of March?
We, as a senior leadership team within the organisation, we'd pretty much anticipated that we would need to look at supporting staff to work from home, because there would be some sort of virus management measures being put into place. You were beginning to get a sense of that from what you were hearing was happening internationally as well. So I'd say, I think the week and a half before we were officially locked down, we began to test working from home. And we did that with our digital and communications team first. They were, in a way, ahead of the game and tested working from home. And then in the lead up to the first lockdown being announced, we started identifying what would be some of the equipment requirements that certain groups of staff would need to work from home, and also that they had the connectivity themselves, which would allow them to do so, particularly for the helpline and the website, the web chat staff in our advice and information service, who can often work with multiple screens in front of them, as whilst also being, speaking to somebody on a phone line. Others might be looking at web chat. So that was a team we prioritised, because we knew that was the way many parents would be trying to contact us. And again, the same issues that you've heard about me talking would affect the families we supported, affected some of our staff, space, where they were going to work, confidentiality, not necessarily having the right types of desks at home or the right types of chairs. So again, as an organisation, that's what we began to prioritise putting in place for staff. Now, it took longer than we would have liked to, but actually there wasn't any delay in service provision for families. That continued irrespective of where somebody was. And again, part of that is we didn't have phone lines which needed to operate for thousands of staff the way local authorities might or others might. We were able to work with our phone provider and quickly have calls transferred to people's work mobiles, etc., so that we were still contactable as an organisation throughout.
You've mentioned, obviously, the pressures that were on staff at the time, and some of the concerns regarding their mental health. How have your staff found it in terms of I suppose, the outcome in the pandemic? Have you lost a lot of staff, or have you managed to support them through it?
We didn't lose any staff during the pandemic and in the period afterwards. And I think that's down to the commitment and passion of the staff. Many of the people who work for One Parent Family Scotland are themselves or have been single parents. So it's a vocation. It's not just a job. So we definitely saw that passion and commitment being at the fore. And secondly, I'd like to think it's partly because we were able to put in such good support mechanisms for staff during it as well, and show that we were all pushing in the same direction. We were working with, it doesn't matter if you're the chief exec, or a family support worker, we were all working together to do what was needed for the families that we supported.
Thank you. We've spoken there about the, I suppose, internal pressures in terms of working for the organisation, and in terms of supporting the families, and in terms of their own work. Were there any external pressures on staff, for example, in respect of key worker status or anything like that?
We weren't officially regarded as being key workers to begin with, and many third sector organisations found themselves in that situation. We had a small group of staff because we ran nursery provision for 2-year-olds who were regarded as being key workers, and it was our childcare facility which slowly opened up before our other services did. But for the rest, none of us were given official key worker status, but we were working collaboratively within the local authority hubs that were created and the support networks that were created as if we were key workers. We designated staff as key workers for OPFS because they were critical to the services being provided, be it, going and picking up cards to be able to add electricity back onto them, etc., for those who are on prepayment meters within houses, be it going and picking up prescriptions for those who couldn't leave the home because of their caring responsibilities, etc., deliveries of food, deliveries of digital equipment. We did all those, and we did network and end up working very closely with other third sector organisations, local authority staff, etc., when that began to be coordinated. But the coordination took time, and there was no official key worker status.
Thank you. I'm going to move on now, if I may, to questions of funding. You've touched upon funding a couple of times, but if I could perhaps ask you first of all regarding funding of OPFS. First of all, how is it funded ordinarily, and were there any changes to that during the pandemic?
We're funded through a range of sources. We get money from the Scottish Government for the Advice and Information Service. We get some core funding through the Scottish Government that's managed by the Cora Foundation. In each of the areas where we have local services, we'll receive some degree of funding from local authorities, and over and above that we get funding from a range of trusts and foundations. In total, in any 1 year, that can be around 40 different sources of funding that we're managing, from very small local bits of money right up to very large multi-year grants. So that's the way we were funded. What we did at the outset of the pandemic was proactively write to every funder to let them know what we were planning on doing, how we were supporting families to work from home, and alternative ways in which we would continue to try to provide some of the group-based support that was done face-to-face, some of the intensive family support work that was done one-to-one. And actually, what we got back were incredibly positive responses from pretty much every funder to say, this is an unprecedented situation. None of us have ever been in this situation before. We totally understand that you won't necessarily be able to deliver X groups of 12 weeks long, providing these outcomes. And we're unrestricting the money for you to do what's needed to support the families. And that was hugely helpful to us as an organisation.
And you've mentioned in your evidence pivoting your services.
Yes.
Did that allow that pivot?
Absolutely. It allowed the pivot. And, it's also great for staff to know that they're trusted, and we're trusted by funders to do what's right for the families that we're working with, and not trying to stick to what would have been a set of very artificial outcomes in such an extraordinary situation.
You mentioned that prior to the pandemic you weren't yourselves a funder,
No.
as it were. Did that continue during the pandemic, or did you become a funder in some circumstances?
It continued during the pandemic, I would say. We learnt an awful lot from it in terms of how best to do it without placing a great deal of additional pressure on staff, and how to do it in a way which treated families with dignity and respect from a position of trust. So I would say we did that. We haven't continued to administer large amounts of money in that way. However, we are involved in a few initiatives now based on our experiences during the pandemic to look to see how we can co-produce with single parents the type of financial support that would support them in difficult circumstances.
Did you have any money during the pandemic to administer in terms of assistance to one-parent families? How did you find that in terms of, I suppose, need for that money?
Oh, overwhelming need for that money. We, fairly near the beginning, we managed to, well, we were fortunate to be given £100,000 from the Scottish Children's Lottery to administer as financial support to families. We gave it as £50 what we called energy grants. The learning for us was that we did that as an open call through our website, through our networks, etc., promoting it. And we had to close it after a day and a half because the demand for it was so great. So that was a real lesson for us. And it wasn't just, individual workers contacting us or families contacting us. One of the things that's really stayed with me is that there was a head teacher of a primary school who had identified a significant number of families who were going to require additional financial support during this period. And she was sat doing a series of applications on their behalf. And when she saw that we were closing it early, she contacted us to say, I'm sat here doing 50-odd applications. I'm not going to get all these done by 12 noon. And we were able to provide a way for her to get those to us when they'd been completed. So what it also showed was the level of need, but also the level of compassion and support there was from those who've worked directly with families in trying to support families to get the financial support they needed. But what we had wasn't enough. And so we did rely on other places where we could get support from. We worked very closely with Aberlour Children's Charity. They had a fund for support. We worked with many families to apply for additional support from there as well. So as well as the monies we were given through charitable trusts and foundations, and I've mentioned Scottish Children's Lottery, Robertson Trust also gave us money. We did then start to get money coming from the Scottish Government through the winter payments for those families that were falling between the gaps of other support. And what we were able to negotiate there was that actually the time families need that money most, in a way, is just after Christmas, because of the expenses of Christmas periods. So we got the flexibilities to be able to provide that money in January and February to families when they needed it most.
Thank you. You've spoken about, nominally what that money was paid out for. You've spoken about the cash first approach, and you've spoken about trusting people.
Yep.
Did you prescribe how that money was spent or require any kind of reporting back in respect of the funding that you were giving out?
No, we didn't. I mean, we kept quite detailed information about who it was going to, where they were. But, we tried to be as flexible as we could. We knew there were some situations, and we were directly contacted by families who were saying, if this goes into my bank account, it's just going to go to feed debt. We're not going to receive any benefit from it. We're not going to get that money back. So in that case, if they would have preferred vouchers, we'd look at how we could provide vouchers so they could still get the food or the other essentials that they needed. We said £50 energy grants, because energy, fuel costs, the additional costs of all being in the house, heating, lighting, etc., were some of the things that families were talking to us about as adding pressures. But it was just £50 extra to go towards, if their most essential need was food, then so be it.
Thank you. That's our hour up, I'm afraid, Ms. Rehman. I'm sure we could speak much longer. Apologies, my lord, we are a minute over, but I am still going to offer you a very brief opportunity if there's anything that you particularly wanted to mention to His Lordship, which we've not had an opportunity to touch upon. His Lordship will be obviously taking everything into account that we've spoken about, and indeed all your statements. But if there are any lessons in particular that you think His Lordship may wish to consider, I'll give you a brief opportunity to mention those now.
Thank you. I was involved in a piece of work after this period where the Scottish Government set up a Social Renewal Advisory Board, and we produced a report called If Not Now, When? And some of the main things I've spoken about and recommendations for how we could have made it better for those families who are the most vulnerable and most at risk, I think are really well set out in that. The cash first approach, the local support, the coordination, the preventative measures that we need to be looking at as a nation. One of the recommendations in there was around how we can develop, for example, a minimum income guarantee for families. If that's set and established and approved by the state, it gives you a mechanism to be able to provide the financial support families need in a much more structured and coherent way than the very crowded landscape that we ended up in. And once we're able to do that with the financial support, it means my staff could have gone in and done more around the emotional support, the practical support, and the learning support.
I'm grateful. My Lord, unless you have anything else to add, that's all the questions I have for this witness.
No, thank you, Mr. Turner. Thank you, Ms. Rehman, for your evidence this morning. That's all. We'll take a break now to 11:15.
Thank you.
Good morning, my lord.
Good morning, Miss van der Westhuizen. Now, you have a panel.
I do, my lord. We're joined this morning by representatives of two organisations that are members of Inclusion Scotland. Firstly, in the room, we have Mr. Steve Robertson, who is the Director of People First Scotland. We have, joining us remotely, Ms. Tressa Burke, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Glasgow Disability Alliance, and Ms. Marianne Scobie, who is Deputy Chief Executive Officer of Glasgow Disability Alliance. We were due to have a fourth panel member, but unfortunately she's not been able to join us this morning, so we will just be three.
Very good. Good morning, Mr. Robertson and Miss Burke and Miss Scobie. Now, there will be questions for you, and I'll ask them to be started now. Thank you.
Thank you, my lord. Before we start, if I could just remind you all that the proceedings are being transcribed. If I could remind you all to speak slowly and clearly, and I'll try to remember to do the same. Perhaps we could start by asking you each to introduce yourselves in turn by confirming your full name, the name of the organisation you represent, and your role now and during the pandemic. And we can perhaps start with Mr. Robertson, followed by Ms. Burke, and followed by Ms. Scobie.
Hello, my name is Steve Robertson, and I'm a Director for People First Scotland. Sitting beside me is Caroline Kingston, who is a development worker with People First Scotland, who is here in a supporting role to me today.
Thank you very much, Mr. Robertson. Ms. Burke, I can't actually see you just because of the way the technology works, but apparently you'll pop up when you speak.
Good morning, I'm Tressa Burke, I'm Chief Exec of Glasgow Disability Alliance.
Thank you very much. And Ms. Scobie.
Hi, good morning. My name is Marianne Scobie and I'm the Deputy Chief Executive of Glasgow Disability Alliance.
And just to confirm, were you all in those roles during the pandemic as well? Thank you, I'm getting nods.
Yes.
Nods all around,
yes.
Thank
yes.
you. With the exception of Mr. Robertson, you all previously attended a roundtable meeting with other members of Inclusion Scotland and the inquiry team. A report has been approved, and that can be found under reference SCI WT 0261-000001. And Mr. Robertson, your colleague, Mr. Halden, attended that, and you're in replacing him today. Thank you. The intention today is for His Lordship to hear about some of the key issues and impacts experienced by your organisations and the people that they support or represent under a number of broad themes. Before I outline those themes, could I please ask you each to provide a brief overview of your organisation, the people it supports or represents, and its work during the pandemic? And perhaps if we could start with Mr. Robertson, and I understand that it'll be Ms. Burke who'll be providing the information on this. So if we could start with Mr. Robertson, please, followed by Ms. Burke.
Thank you. Just to say, People First is a self-advocacy organisation. It's okay.
Yep.
People First is a self-advocacy organisation run by and for people with a learning disability. Our board of directors is made up entirely of people with a learning disability. Members meet in self-advocacy groups across Scotland. We work towards the realisation and promotion of the human rights of citizens under the labels of learning disability or intellectual impairment. National workers support members to take forward campaigns which are based on the issues we have discussed. No, just move a bit forward, sorry. I'll just start again. National workers support members to take forward campaigns which are based on the issues we have discussed in our self-advocacy groups. For lots of members, People First is the only place we have to be honest about our life experiences, to be taken seriously, and to campaign for change. During the pandemic, we were not able to meet in our self-advocacy groups, and this had a huge impact on members. We very quickly switched to telephone calls to keep in touch with the membership and supporting members to connect digitally. But as I will talk about later, there were significant challenges, and we know that some members simply lost access to their own organisation.
Thank you very much, Ms. Robertson. Thank you. And then Ms. Burke, if I could invite you to provide a bit of background to Glasgow Disability Alliance.
Yeah. Thank you for asking. So Glasgow Disability Alliance is an organisation controlled by disabled people for disabled people. So we are accountable to a board of disabled people who are elected by our membership. And we do three things kind of in summary. One is we work with people at an individual level to build their capacity, and we do that through a range of programmes. So primarily it was a learning and development programme that we used to run in the very early days, and we still do very much. And we provide welfare rights also to disabled people as well to try and maximise their benefits. We also amplify disabled people's voices by building the collective voice and the collective capacity, again bringing alive the idea of nothing about us without us, which is a mantra that we stick to. And we share the lived experience that disabled people share with us, with government, with policy makers, so that they can take part in dialogue and deliberation and collective advocacy. And the idea is about challenging exclusion and trying to help co-design better policies and services and decisions that impact on us. So the third thing that we do in that regard is collaborating for change with the local and national government to try and come up with solutions and sharing those lived experience, insights and evidence to try and shape policy and co-design solutions, services, policies and anything else that we can come up with for disabled people to try and improve their lives. That all often involves trying to educate people about what disabled people's lives are actually like. So that bit about sharing lived experience is really important, because most people don't understand what the barriers are and how interrelated they are. And during the pandemic, that was something that we weren't starting from a level playing field. So we often say we might have all been in the same storm, but we weren't all in the same boat, and disabled people had less lifelines and less ability to cope and resilience because so much was cut off. So one of the things that we did was we had to stop all our face-to-face activities, which was the way that we operated. Our delivery model was based on seeing people face-to-face and helping them out individually and collectively. But what we had to do was phone all our members, and at that point we had 5,000 members. So we phoned all of the members. Some of the members were deaf people, so they were texted or emailed, and we reached out to everybody really to check in and see how they were getting on, to see if there were things that they needed, to see how they were coping, and to see what could be done if they weren't. And a lot of that was about providing information about the health information, the public health information, and translating it into a way that people could understand, because there was a bit of confusion, as I think we'll all remember back. So we got all our supports and services at that time online. So that was our learning programmes and our activities that reduced social isolation, and we had to gear up the disabled people to learn how to get online, and maybe say a wee bit about that later. But in short, digital connections is a massive barrier for disabled people, and of the 6,000 people in the end that we spoke to over that first year, 60% were digitally disconnected. So that was a massive challenge to get people online, and many people chose not to do that, and many people chose not to take devices or supports, so remained quite excluded and quite cut off from support and information. But we tried our best at that time to do that. We set up a digital connect service, and we set up a wellbeing support to help with the extreme challenges to people's mental health and well-being that were happening at that time. And the other thing that was added from our point of view was the provision of food and vital resources to disabled people, because despite the fact that the people that were supposedly targeted by shielding, and there were good efforts made, no doubt about it, but disabled people were very much excluded from that and cut off because they didn't understand a lot of the barriers that disabled people face, and therefore some of the approaches weren't actually helpful, and people were receiving things like root vegetables when they'd had their social care cut off and they couldn't use their hands to deal with some of the food that they were being provided with. So disabled people were slipping through the gap and weren't responded to as well as we'd hoped. So that's kind of hopefully a summary outline of who we are and what we did during the pandemic.
Thank you very much, Ms. Burke. And we'll come on to speak about some of the issues you've raised there in more detail during the discussion. One thing I forgot to mention is just that we've got 2 hours if we need it. We don't need to use the whole time. I'll aim to take a break, my lord, at around the 1 hour mark, just for 15 minutes. Time permitting, just propose to discuss issues and impacts under the following broad themes. Firstly, widening of pre-existing inequalities. Secondly, digital inclusion. Thirdly, mental health and well-being and social impacts. Fourthly, access to food and other essential goods. Fifthly, housing. Sixth, impacts on organisations themselves. 7, any ongoing impacts. And finally, potential lessons to be learned. So if we could perhaps turn to the first topic, which is widening of pre-existing inequalities, and if I could invite you to elaborate on examples such as the extent to which disabled people were on unequal footing from the outset, changes in access to services, changes in access to transport, disproportionate impacts of the pandemic and restrictions on disabled people, and any other relevant key issues or impacts. And if we could perhaps start with Mr. Robertson, followed by Ms. Burke, and then Ms. Scobie. Mr. Robertson, when you're ready.
Thank you. People with a learning disability lead unequal lives, and this was the case long before the pandemic. We are treated as different, as less than, and we are not given the same opportunities in life as other people. Support to live a full life has never been made available to us. Accessible information to support our understanding of the world does not exist. Scottish laws discriminate against us, as highlighted by learning disability being included in the definition of mental disorder, which allows us to be detained on the basis of our disability. And the Adults with Incapacity Act, which takes away our legal right to make decisions. Less than 7% of people with a learning disability are in paid employment. Most of us rely on benefits, which means many of us live in poverty. Many of us are digitally excluded. There are many barriers to health care, and we die on average 20 years before the rest of the population. This is our lived reality. We were already isolated, and then the pandemic happened, and decisions were taken which further discriminated against us. The limited support we received was further reduced at a time when we needed that support more than ever. The lack of accessible information left us struggling to understand what was happening. Emergency legislation further discriminated against us, with less opportunity for scrutiny of law and policy that removes our human rights. Without connection through employment or relationships, many of us experienced extreme social isolation. Barriers to accessing health care increased because of complex new processes and messaging. Messaging to stay away from GPs unless necessary were confusing for members to interpret. Some members were so scared that they avoided trying to access healthcare at all. Losing access to healthcare when we didn't have equal access in the first place was incredibly damaging. Our risk of death from COVID-19 was twice as high as citizens without learning disabilities. Our risk of being infected with COVID was 3 times as high. And some members of our organisation are actually 10 times as likely to die from COVID. Despite this, we are not seen as a priority for shielding for the vaccine or for boosters. We always came far down the list of those thought about. We are also aware of people with a learning disability having do not resuscitate order placed on their medical notes, sometimes without their knowledge or any discussion about why. In England, figures were gathered that said many more people with a learning disability died during the crisis than other citizens. But for a long time, we did not have the figures of how many people with a learning disability died of COVID-19 in Scotland. We campaigned and used our position in the Scottish Learning Disabilities Observatory steering group to push for Scottish statistics to be gathered. This eventually happened and showed the much higher numbers of people with learning disabilities being infected or dying from COVID-19. We used these statistics to successfully campaign for people with learning disabilities to be given higher priority for the COVID-19 vaccine. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Robertson. Ms. Burke.
So just, I suppose, taking the issue that you're asking about pre-existing inequalities, important to say that disabled people weren't starting from a level playing field and were experiencing, and still to this day experiencing, a range of inequalities and barriers across the whole of our lives. That is much, much worse for disabled people who are living in poverty and not working. So I would take that as the first thing, that disabled people were already much more prone not to be in education or work, or not to achieve the same standard of qualification, certainly from education, and even if in work, to tend to be in work that is less well paid, and even a disabled graduate is less likely to earn less than a non-disabled non-graduate. So I think that that's a stat that still stands. Transport being something that disabled people experience barriers to, lack of adequate social care, and services generally, services maybe being available but not accessible. The physical environment having lots of barriers, and as Steve mentioned there, communication and information not being accessible to disabled people has always been a problem, and particularly during the pandemic that was heightened. Many disabled people experiencing homelessness effectively because their house isn't accessible to them, or not being able to get the aids and equipment that they need. Inadequate and inaccessible health services, including mental health and wellbeing services, and people not having access to the peers and the role models that other people have, because disabled people can quite easily be invisible in society, and it's partly why I think there is a lack of understanding, and it's a bit of a chicken and egg, because maybe if there was more understanding there would be less barriers and we would be more visible. And just picking up on Steve's point about people with learning difficulties, so we very much stand alongside People First and the experiences that the members of People First represent here today. And just to say that Glasgow Disability Alliance and Inclusion Scotland have individual members but also organisational members, and People First Glasgow is a member of GDA, and we ourselves have hundreds of members with learning disabilities as well as people with mental health problems, physical impairments, people with communication barriers, and so on. So it's the full range of impairments that disabled people have. And just as Steve said, all of that was exacerbated by the pandemic, with people having their supports cut off and access to services. So in Glasgow, for example, 1,884 social care packages were cut or halted at the outset of the pandemic, and that's a stat given by Glasgow Integrated Joint Board to the BBC in April 2020. So we know that that's true. We also know that health appointments were cut by, I think, 70% or more and moved online, which was no good, because for disabled people, 60% didn't have access to IT, they didn't have access to broadband or the kit, the equipment or the confidence to be able to use it. Disabled people in Glasgow couldn't access services or support. They didn't know where to go for support. I think our survey at that time showed that 83% of people couldn't access services and over 80% didn't know where to go for support or information. So things were very, very stark for disabled people at the outset of the pandemic in Glasgow, and that continued on. More than 50% of people, I think it was 57% at that time of the 6,000 we engaged with, were reporting that they were really worried about money and financial hardship. And that was sometimes because it wasn't always that they didn't have money, it was that they couldn't access it, they couldn't get out, and they had no support to be able to go out. And partly our food response, I mean, largely it was about people not being able to access food and not get out of the house and not be able to go to the shops, or not having the practical support that they normally might have had to be able to go out and go and get messages and shopping. But some of the time it was because people just didn't have access to the money that they needed to be able to do that, or the transport. And I think that thing I said at the start, just a wee moment ago, about the interrelated barriers, all of those barriers that exist, it's like a domino effect, in that people don't have access to a range of things, which makes it exponentially that their exclusion and their disadvantage is so much higher, and it means that they were much more disadvantaged during the pandemic.
Thank you very much, Ms. Burke. And Ms. Scobie, if I could invite you in now.
Thank you, thanks. I'll try not to repeat things that Tressa and Steve have said, but just picking up on one of the things that Tressa said there in relation to people not being able to access local services, that around 80% of people told us that they couldn't access services. It's important to recognise that pre-pandemic, our research showed that it was 71% of people who couldn't access services and facilities and leisure activities in their local areas. So that was absolutely a pre-existing inequality that disabled people were facing. We know that 60% of deaths from COVID were of disabled people, but the clinical risk that disabled people had, that alone doesn't explain why there were so many deaths of disabled people. So that's one of the things, obviously, of why we're here today, to look at what those other factors might have been. We saw that there was lots of public health messaging at the beginning, where the deaths from COVID were almost being dismissed as people who had pre-existing conditions. And for those of us who do have pre-existing conditions, that made us feel, completely worthless and valueless right from the beginning of the pandemic. And that sort of set the tone of what to expect throughout the pandemic. And it felt like the deaths of disabled people with pre-existing conditions, just didn't matter as much as anyone else. And again, just thinking about pre-existing inequalities, disabled people were more likely to be living in poverty, more likely to be unemployed, and those that are employed more likely to be in a low-paid work. And Tressa mentioned the packages of care that were taken, just removed from disabled people. And one of the main reasons for that is because the care workers who are providing those packages were themselves disabled people who have medical conditions that meant that they were shielding, and or they were carers of family members who were having to shield. So it just shows that within those workforces, a lot of those people themselves are actually also clinically vulnerable or supporting someone who's clinically vulnerable in their own families. We had huge issues with housing, so many disabled people have live in housing that just doesn't meet their needs, and that further exacerbated their position during the pandemic. Tress already mentioned access to health and social care support. The other thing that disabled people experience more than anyone else is hate crime. So hate crime, whether it was a high-level crimes against disabled people or hate incidents, antisocial behaviour, and so on and so forth, there were huge, a huge rise in that during the pandemic as well. And I think it's also, as Tressa said, we are a pan-impairment organisation, so we're supporting people across a whole spectrum of disability or impairment, but we also work on an intersectional basis, and we're supporting disabled people who have additional protected characteristics. So, for example, LGBT plus disabled people of colour, and so on, and we saw that their inequalities, again, already pre-existing, more so than anyone else, again further exacerbated during the pandemic because of additional factors that they faced as disabled people with additional protected characteristics. As I said, I'm sure we're going to touch on all of these things in more detail as we go on. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Scobie. The next topic we have is digital inclusion, and if I could invite you just to discuss with His Lordship or outline for His Lordship any particular issues, including, for example, issues with services moving online, access to bank accounts, access to benefits, accommodations that disabled people had been perhaps asking for pre-pandemic becoming possible, disproportionate impacts on particular groups of disabled people, any positive impacts, and any other relevant key issues. And if I could perhaps invite Mr. Robertson to start again, followed by Ms. Burke and then Ms. Scobie.
Thank you. During lockdown, so much moved online, and this excluded the majority of people with a learning disability. Access to benefits, bus pass renewals, essential and non-essential goods, access to up-to-date information about the virus, and restrictions all came down to whether you had access to the internet or not. Digital exclusion is overwhelming for citizens with a learning disability. And exclusion takes many forms, and it can be due to where and what type of setting people live in. For example, people in assessment and treatment units, care homes, and other places which restrict digital and other life opportunities further. What, if any, social care or other support those citizens receiving, and income, which is almost universally low and benefit-based. In some cases, financial decision-making is denied to the person themselves, and those decisions are made by others. That can be a further barrier to digital presence and connection. The Connecting Scotland scheme, which was introduced to support people who are digitally excluded, did not apply to people with a learning disability unless we met other criteria. In People First Scotland, a huge amount of time, effort and resources went into buying iPads and supporting over the phone to enable members to use these devices and access platforms such as Microsoft Teams and Zoom. Workers switched from supporting in-person groups to spending a huge amount of time on the phone to people, guiding them through how to use Zoom. Workers were dropping off iPads at people's doors to make sure they had them. We spent time creating easy read guides to accessing and using Zoom. This was the only way that members could participate in self-advocacy groups or in government meetings where decisions were being made. Unfortunately, though, for many of the reasons we have described, there were members who were excluded from participating. The impact of this was huge. Members lost access to their own organisation, a place where they have power, feel valued, and can be involved in decision-making processes. Often the only opportunity in life to do so. The quantity and speed of information that was being shared at the beginning of the pandemic was overwhelming, and it was extremely challenging to understand what was going on with a lack of accessible information. There was a lot of confusion about which groups of people should be shielding and what supports were on offer to them. People First Scotland worked with Scottish Government and Scottish Commission for People with a Learning Disability throughout lockdown to create easy read updates. However, there was still a gap in providing consistent, accessible information. Often the only way to share easy read updates about restrictions were online. So again, people who were digitally excluded missed out on this information. We tried to keep in touch with these members over the phone as much as possible to make sure they were up to date with the various restrictions. This became incredibly complex when the restrictions were changing rapidly and were different in different areas. We also worked with Public Health Scotland on developing easy read letters about COVID vaccine appointments. We pushed for the easy read letters to be sent as standard, but the information was not routinely provided in easy read, and often these documents were only available online, hidden deep within a website, rather than on the home page, which was a barrier for people who are not digitally connected. The support we offered to people to have digital access should have been something that was already in place. This is another example of where people with a learning disability were already excluded and marginalised, and the pandemic made that situation much worse. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Robertson. Ms. Burke.
Thanks so much. Yeah, and I think just backing up what Steve said about pandemic responses really did create new inequalities and left disabled people behind, as well as supercharging the inequalities they originally faced. So with regards specifically to the digital exclusion and the impact on services and support, so much moved online, as you know, and in the case of the 6,000 people plus that we spoke to, 60% were digitally excluded. So this took away a whole group of people when services and supports moved online. And choice was taken away from people as well who might not have wanted to access services. And I still have genuine worries about the GDA members and other disabled people on a wider basis across Scotland who didn't manage to take up the digital supports that were being given at that time. So I know that a lot of organisations had good intentions, and we know that, for example, lots of the housing associations gave out devices, and were getting devices from the government, but we were getting referrals all the time from organisations saying we've got people here, but they're not teachable. We can't teach them. They're not going to be able to learn. And we managed, using our digital coaching service that we set up, and it wasn't technical experts at all. It was just people who were committed to trying to help. We were a step ahead to trying to help disabled people who were good communicators, managed to coach people in 6 or 7 different languages. It might have been more, Marianne will correct that. Also people who were visually impaired, people who didn't know what the word click or swipe. These are not words that people know if they don't know them in that context, the digital context. So how do you actually help a person who's never actually opened a device or held a device in their hands before over the phone when they can't see or when they can't speak English as a first language? And we managed to do that, but it wasn't being routinely done. So I worry about all the people who missed out, including our own members who didn't take it up. People just they couldn't order shopping, they couldn't get the shopping delivery slots even if they could, but they mainly couldn't order the shopping online. They weren't able to pay their bills. A lot of the supports that were happening in communities just weren't available to disabled people. So I think there were great community responses to be celebrated in Scotland, and some responses from agencies as well. But I think that they replicated the existing lack of understanding about disabled people's inequality and all the things that need to be broken down, all the barriers to make sure that disabled people benefit from responses. So unfortunately, a lot of community responses, as with agencies, actually excluded disabled people and didn't meet their needs, and that included the responses that were set up to deal with digital. A lot of people, I think Steve, beautifully touched on this and expanded on it, about people losing access to their own organisations, which might have been very niche and very, very good at supporting and understanding the barriers people experience, like People First, and they were members of that organisation, but they may not have been able to benefit from what happened next, which was people going online, the only option that we all had open to us, but people were really excluded from that. And there was a move to digital first to provide services and information which people just couldn't benefit from. Some people received a MiFi. So, for example, we worked with the government's Connecting Scotland programme and got MiFis for all the members of ours that wanted to take it up, and wider, not just our members, but we were helping people across Glasgow and Scotland who needed help as well at that time. But it was limited in broadband, so people were having to choose between coming to an online peer support session or speaking to their family on Zoom, because the broadband was limited. And we all take broadband for granted in a way that we don't need to calculate usage like that, but disabled people did at that time, because it wasn't provided in a way that meant that they could use it universally the way we all can. I know that people who were in hospitals weren't able to be digitally connected because of the restrictions that were put in place in hospitals, and a lot of disabled young people didn't get suitable digital devices and additional equipment that they maybe needed to allow them to continue either their peer support and their connections to friends or their education. So there was that level of exclusion. I think a lot of young people lost out, but disabled young people even more so. I think just, again, saying that it was difficult and challenging for disabled people to learn to use the digital equipment and learn to use the access to broadband, but it was possible, and that wasn't something that was routinely done. It was mainly disabled people-led organisations that put the time and energy into that, because we believed it was possible, and because we already know that you have to break multiple barriers down to be able to give disabled people the support that they need. So we were able to try and put that previous experience into practice in that regard as well. And I'll leave Marianne to pick up on other issues.
Thank you very much. Ms Scobie, if I could invite you in now.
Thank you. Thanks. And thanks, Tressa and Steve. I think just starting with the access to money, I think that many disabled people had and still have post office accounts where their money is actually held at the post office, and they were used to going to the post office to withdraw money and to do their banking there. So they weren't doing, they weren't able to do telephone banking or online banking, and then the post offices were shut. So for some people, it wasn't that they didn't have money; it was very clearly that they didn't have access to their own money because of the move to online, and because of the fact that the physical buildings and services were closed. Like we mentioned before, 60% of disabled people face digital exclusion, and 80% of people weren't able to access the local community facilities and services that popped up during the pandemic. And a lot of the reasons for that was because much of the information about it was online, or that you could only access it online. And even for those people who could get online, a lot of the information that was shared online was not shared in formats that were accessible. And a lot of the time that wasn't for any sort of bad reason. It was mainly through ignorance, that local communities didn't know how to make information accessible to people if they were presenting it online. And one of the things that we were doing was trying to work with local communities to teach them how to make their online communications more accessible. Tressa and Steve touched on the Connecting Scotland programme, which, in theory was a great programme, but didn't actually meet the needs of disabled people very well. The fact that we were from a key Connecting Scotland partner, we're getting referrals from people where we were told these people are too disabled to learn, so can you work with them instead? And that was the attitude that we were presented with, that people were too disabled to learn. And as Tressa said, that we actually were able to support them and to help them to get online. And some of the physical things, that many organisations who received devices were just giving them out to people. So people were receiving an unboxed device that had not been set up. Nobody, it was still in the cellophane wrapper and so on and so forth. People were given SIM cards without knowing what a SIM card is or what to do with it. And if you can imagine how tiny a SIM card is, and how difficult that is for many disabled people, even if you could understand what you were to do with it, but to physically, be able to do that was quite impossible. And we found that months and even years down the line, people still had these unboxed devices in their house that nobody had ever, someone had, gratefully delivered to them, but had never showed them how to actually do anything with it. So one of the things, the lessons that we learned really quickly was that we had to unbox those devices. We had to put the SIM cards in. We had to set them up. We had to put apps that people could use, like Zoom, for example, on the homepage so that people could access it, and then give someone the device and then teach them, so that we were actually removing some of those barriers to learning straight from the beginning. One housing association, just as an example, had 62 devices that they could allocate to people because the people they'd literally been handed back. So 62 devices that a housing association had got from Connecting Scotland were being handed back because none of the people that they were giving them to were able to access them, and that was disabled and older people. Things around academic learning and schools, universities. Just before the pandemic in early 2020, one of our young members had actually had to give up a university course that they had, up till that point been really enjoying and getting on really well with, but because of a change in their health and impairment, they'd had to give up the university course because they were told, because they weren't able to go in to classes, and they were missing classes, and they were basically removed from the course. And that's just one story. And literally a few months later, everybody in university was able to access online learning. And that's something that disabled people had been calling for years and years. And we'd been told for years and years that it was completely impossible. You couldn't go to university, you couldn't do classes online. But as soon as non-disabled people needed these things, everything changed overnight, and it was possible for them. So we would say, why was it not possible for disabled people up to that point? We have to think about what the motivation is, and again, that goes back to the pre-existing inequality of disabled people. And similarly, schools and other learning and indeed working from home and so on, which could be set up because of when the digital support is in place and it's set up properly, then disabled people can participate online and do their job like we are today and participating digitally because we've got the facility to do that, and previously that may have not been in place. One of the things that we did at GD in terms of digital inclusion was that we had to not only teach disabled people how to use devices and to get the devices to them, but we also had to teach our tutors. So as Tressa mentioned earlier, we were used to delivering in-person sessions, learning activities and events for disabled people. So one of the things that we did was work with all the tutors who wanted to move their work online, and we had to teach them how to use Zoom, how to use online platforms to be able to deliver their sessions, and also work with them to think about how to reconstruct their sessions so that they could be successfully delivered online. And added to that, and again this goes back to pre-existing inequalities, many disabled people didn't have the resources and the materials to take part in activities online. So we had to supply those to disabled people as well. So that could be things like art materials and art activities. Some people didn't have as much as a pen and pencil and some paper in their house that they could participate in some of these classes. So we had to get the packs to the people, because it's no point in just putting a class online if people can't actually physically take part because they don't have the materials and the resources. So it was all these joining up all these other things that made it possible for us to be successful in moving our resources on our activities online. And just thinking about moving on to some of the positive aspects that you asked us to comment on. So some of the positive things were that because certain activities moved online, so for example music concerts, theatre performances and so on, for the first time many disabled people were able to access, like anyone else, theatre, music gigs, theatre performances, different things that normally we would be excluded from because we can't access in-person theatre shows or music gigs. And one again, Steve commented on this the safe space of being together. So being able to continue to run our LGBT disabled people's network online, our young people's network online, our Black, Asian, minority ethnic group online, and be able to support people to continue to meet each other for that really important peer support was really crucial and vital to help people just cope and get information on a day-to-day basis. And something else that again has become a positive aspect of online moving online and supporting people around digital inclusion is the fact that there were so many funerals, as you can imagine, particularly at the beginning of the pandemic. There was so many funerals and people just couldn't attend funerals just because of obviously public health restrictions. But many funeral services were moved online, and again for many disabled people in a pre-COVID simply weren't able to access funerals of their family and friends because of the whole nature of funerals being completely inaccessible, whether that's the transport to get back and forward to a funeral or the physical building and so on around that. But for the first time, many disabled people were able to access a funeral online and feel like they were connecting with their friends, their families, their peers, and be able to pay their respects to someone who had died, that they wanted to be able to be part of that process and part of that healing process. And that was a huge comfort to people who were able to do that because of digital, the move to online. So while there were many negative impacts on disabled people in relation to online, there were also many positive impacts as well. But just to finish off, what I would comment on is many of those positive impacts have already been removed. So for a lot of people going to the theatre, going to music concerts and so on, it was great. Even being able to watch a new film via the cinema via an online link. Many of that, in fact, most of that has all been taken away. So people got a glimpse of what it was like to be able to do these things, and now it's all been taken away again. So that's back to the digital exclusion. So I'll finish there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Scobie. I think we'll have time for one more topic before we have a break. So the next one is mental health and well-being and social impacts. And if I could ask you just to explain any particular impacts and issues in relation to, for example, mental health and well-being, any impacts on disabled people detained in hospitals, social or community isolation and loneliness, fear and anxiety around leaving home, access to recreational space and facilities, the Spaces for People initiative and issues with wheelchair access and disabled parking, disproportionate impacts on particular groups of disabled people, or any other relevant key issues or impacts. And if I could invite Mr. Robertson to start again, followed this time by Ms. Scobie and then Ms. Burke.
Thank
Mr.
you.
Robertson, thank you.
Support for community inclusion was already weak or non-existent for people with a learning disability before the pandemic. For example, members of this organisation may have had a couple of hours a week where they had to choose between support to pay a bill or support to buy food. Others may have attended a day centre where people with a learning disability are grouped together and not supported to connect with the wider community. But even these inadequate supports were stopped during the pandemic. Day centres, which were some members' only connection with the outside world, were closed and support at home was cut. While many other citizens still had employment, which provided social connection, less than 7% of people with a learning disability are employed. This left people with a learning disability scared, lonely and isolated. Digital inclusion meant that keeping in touch with people online was not an option for many people with a learning disability. For some people, their support teams switched to phone calls instead of visiting them. This might have consisted of just a 2-minute check-in. Support workers didn't know they weren't okay because they couldn't see them in person. A phone call is no replacement for in-person, face-to-face support. It is hard to fully express the impact of cutting off people's support, especially at a time when we needed support more than ever. Part of having a learning disability means we need support to understand and process new information. This was a time when the world and associated rules were rapidly changing day by day. We needed support to navigate this new world, and we were left to fend for ourselves. Support is what enables people to live a life. It is a human right. We would also like to draw attention to people with a learning disability detained in hospitals. The Scottish Government has recognised through the Coming Home work that people with a learning disability are inappropriately detained in hospitals for far too long, but there has been little recognition of the impact on these people of decisions taken during the pandemic. Emergency legislation that was introduced meant greater power in the hands of professionals, lower levels of scrutiny, and the potential for significantly increased periods of detention. Blanket policies were introduced and applied that impacted on human rights. Advocacy, which was often the only route to have your voice heard, was not allowed into the units. And staff in the units were not supporting access to online video calling with advocacy. Due to the pandemic, the Mental Welfare Commission postponed all scheduled local visits in March 2020. The Commission switched to virtual visits, which sometimes meant speaking to ward staff on the phone and no contact with patients. We know from experience that this means things go unnoticed or unobserved. Crucially, no visits from family were allowed, and there was a lack of support to use video calls to have contact with family. Sometimes there was only one telephone in the ward for all of the patients, so there was no privacy when trying to speak to family. Similarly, there were sometimes strict rules around when people could make these phone calls. Patients were isolated to their rooms. The small amount of activities that were on offer before the pandemic then cut to none. Blanket decisions were made to close dining areas, forcing patients to eat alone in their bedrooms. Reduced staffing levels further increased seclusion and isolation. Some people were never allowed outside during this time. Terrified and alone, some may have expressed this through behaviour viewed as challenging, which would then result in further restraint and seclusion. We may never know what people really went through during this time when there was no scrutiny or inspection from external agencies. This was an abuse of our human rights, and this can never happen again.
Thank you, Mr. Robertson. Sorry, I've got a tickle. Ms. Scobie, if I can invite you in.
Thank you. Thanks. So I think that I just wanted to concentrate a bit more on the social and community isolation and loneliness. And as we said, that 80% of disabled people were not able to access the support in their local communities, and we've mentioned around digital exclusion in relation to that. But one of the other things that related to a lot of the isolation and loneliness for disabled people was that there was a huge drive to support, in quotes, the elderly in local communities. It was very much geared up to supporting older people and the elderly, as local communities put it. But there wasn't necessarily much thought for disabled people and what they needed, and particularly younger disabled people. So we have examples of disabled people who were turned away from local supports because they weren't the elderly, they were too young, and they weren't necessarily presenting as a disabled person in need. And we found that in relation to lots of more sort of statutory supports as well as community supports, and that extends to things like people going to the supermarkets. When there was there were time slots, for example, for older people to go to the supermarket where it would be quiet and where there would be more support in place. People being turned away from early morning slots because they didn't look disabled, they weren't disabled enough, or they were too young, and people being sort of bullied and ridiculed and picked on. Literally in a queue in the supermarket, just because they didn't look disabled enough, and lots of younger disabled people in particular found that, which was, and the irony for them was the fact that sometimes they were supporting an older family member who was unable to get out, and they, as a younger disabled person, felt that they would go and do the shopping for the family, for example, and were still finding that they weren't able to go out and access those particular facilities. And then again, in many places, seats were taken away. So in local parks, for example, all the park benches were taped off, and that was to prevent people from gathering in groups. But it also meant that disabled people with mobility impairments weren't able to go for a walk in the park because they were not able to then sit down for even a few minutes to rest, to enable them to continue to go for a walk, or to go out with a with their families and be, just be able to get a seat while their family or, their children might have been playing in the park. And again, added to that, public toilet facilities being closed. So again, we had disabled people and disabled families being unable to go out for any sort of leisure or recreation to support their mental health and well-being as a family, because there was no, parking wasn't available, public toilets weren't available, accessible toilets weren't available, so that prevented families, particularly families who have no garden space of their own, to be able to access some outdoor space. Another group of people that we heard from is that they are LGBT disabled people who, again, needed some safe space to meet. They weren't necessarily people who were out to their families, for example, or who had relationships where they needed to be able to meet people on a face-to-face basis, because there was no safe space to do that indoors. And again, places like going for a walk in the park or going into town, just for a walk around, was really, really difficult and challenging because of the fact that parking facility were removed, and that seats and benches were removed or taped over. And we facilitated a meeting with Police Scotland and disabled people, and included in the group of disabled people were autistic people who were really quite concerned and upset around the rules constantly changing around where you could go and how long you could go, how far away from your house you could go, and again with benches taped over in local parks and so on. So people who were really confused and really upset around rules. And we did speak to Police Scotland about, to ask for some flexibility around that, to ask if we could think about how the law was going to be interpreted, but we didn't really get anywhere with that. But at least we felt that we'd spoken to Police Scotland and been heard, although nothing happened as a result of it. There was lots of fear and anxiety over the virus itself, and people being really, really terrified to go outside, considering that the public health messaging at the time was just full of everyone who was dying had pre-existing medical conditions. So people were already living with that level of anxiety, and then having to go out into a world where they were being ridiculed and picked on because they were wearing a face mask, for example, or because they needed a seat and couldn't sit down anywhere, or they were having to fight to get something that they were so apparently entitled to, like, for example, to be able to shop in certain places at certain times because they were disabled, and having to fight to be recognised as such. In relation to spaces for people, so that was the scheme to make sure that local areas had wider pavements, for example, so that people could, go to shops and restaurants, or just out for a walk where there was more space to be able to be socially distant from each other. And much of the changes around spaces for people were made with very little or no consultation. They just appeared overnight with very little thought to how that might impact people. When we, as an organisation, spoke to Glasgow City Council about this, we were given a 20-minute phone conversation, and in which we were told that all the decisions had been made. There was no space, within the plans to adapt it or change it to include any of the things that we felt would have made it better for disabled people. And we were also told that, don't worry, these were temporary measures and that they'll all go back to normal, back to how it was. And unfortunately, what we found afterwards was that had been removed within the city centre, so that people couldn't park, disabled people couldn't park. They were now, although the pavements were made wider, they were now full of street furniture and tables and chairs, street cafes. They were now bollards and planters, which may have looked very nice for some people, but meant that there were no access to drop curbs to be able to navigate on and off curbs, so people were having to walk on the pavements. Blind and visually impaired people were finding that they weren't able to navigate across a wide, busy pavement, which was now cluttered with street furniture and with tables and chairs and people having fun when they just wanted to be able to get about their business. So the impact on disabled people in terms of spaces for people has been quite horrendous at the time, and still is a huge problem for disabled people. And much of that could have been avoided if we'd actually just spoken to us, because some of it would have been very welcome for disabled people, but the impact of not involving disabled people in the discussions around that meant that what it created was a really hostile environment for many disabled people, and actually resulted in more disabled people not being able to access an area where they might have otherwise been able to access just for exercise or for leisure, or to meet up with friends and family. I'll hand over to Tressa now, if that's okay.
Thank you very much. Ms Burke.
Thank you, yeah. So just kind of picking up from where Marianne's just left off. So obviously there was a lot of exclusion, which we know disabled people are more prone to anyway, and we know about their interrelated barriers, which I've covered earlier. And all of those things that Marianne's saying were really increasing the level of hostility and exclusion that disabled people had previously faced. And on top of that, there were examples given by GDA members where disabled people were being shouted at, spat at, and this is a number of examples of this, being blamed for the virus because they were out in the street, but at the same time people shouting at them that they shouldn't be out because they were so vulnerable. So there were a lot of things happening, definitely increased hostility and hate crimes, which was just absolutely awful. So there were fears from the general public, of course, about where it was coming from and how it was spreading, and misunderstanding and misinformation about that. But at the same time, this was all happening in the context of disabled people having discovered that do not resuscitate files were being put on their notes, which they hadn't agreed to or didn't understand. And it just felt like disabled people were very much being put to the bottom of the pile, and it was very much a threat to our human rights, and people didn't really understand how that was all happening, or how we could have come to this point. And I suppose the thing that I would emphasise about all of this is the impact that it's had on disabled people's mental health. So during the first 6 months to a year of the pandemic, we spoke to more than 6,000 people. Of those people, over 90% were worried about both physical and mental health, including me and Marianne, particularly about our physical health. But 62% of those 90-odd% of people, 62% were genuinely concerned about the impact on their mental health during the pandemic. And that was a growing number, because at the start people didn't realise that it was going to go on for any length of time at all. People refused support, people said they were fine, people weren't too worried about isolation in the first couple of weeks, but as things started to feel more real, that changed very much, and 62% were worried about their mental health. And I think that there is something that people might not understand, which is that many disabled people we're working with, their primary impairment or diagnosis is that they have a mental health condition, but many also are people like me and Marianne with a physical condition, and as a result of barriers, of exclusion, of loneliness, of not being able to work the way the two of us can, and not be connected, people go on to develop quite reasonable responses, which are depression and anxiety about their exclusion and about not being able to participate in their own lives or their communities or their families or just any part of society. So that was already the position for disabled people. And then we were discovering that the deaths of disabled people, which were higher than other people, weren't being taken seriously, were being written off as though we would just die anyway, and maybe we should just have DNRs on our files, not understanding how our lives could have been turned into so worthless. And we already had a sense of that before, but it was very, very much supercharged, a word we use to describe all the inequalities. So there had been problems before about people not being able to access mental health services, but that was again increased and exacerbated during the pandemic, and people felt that they didn't have access to the support that they needed in terms of mental health, so people felt very much left behind. We undertook a piece of work called Disabled People's Mental Health Matters, and it showed that disabled people really were not able to access the support that they need. Particularly young disabled people knew what they needed to do to keep their well-being at a state that, you know, they felt more well, but that they weren't able to do that because the types of things they needed weren't being provided. The access to peer support, the access to online, the access to digital, the access to information that they needed, and so on. So all the things that we've spoken about, people were very concerned about the Coronavirus Scotland Act and how that made the I suppose the powers that local authorities had and the laws around detention were more relaxed. So people felt that they had less rights in law, the ability to be able to assess people in the way that local authorities could do. And we know it came from a good place. It came from a place of trying to be flexible, but it allowed local authorities who'd already cut the packages not necessarily to take the steps that needed taken to be able to assess need and meet need as it was actually being experienced at that time. And at that time, we set up GDA Wellbeing. Again, we were not specialists in this area, but we did employ people with this area of expertise to try and respond to some of the needs. And people felt that this was something that, you know, we originally thought that it was going to be a kind of almost wellbeing check-in, and it ended up being something which was supporting disabled people who did have diagnosis of mental health issues, who often had a psychiatrist but weren't able to access their psychiatrist or their CPN. A phrase that was used to me was that the phones are ringing off the hook. I heard that multiple times, that people just couldn't access the supports that they need. And I would say with great regret that a lot of the support, both social care and mental health and services in general, have not been reinstated to pre-pandemic levels, and in fact have been used as a way of cutting disabled people's support. So the impact on people's mental health has been pretty devastating. Our current wellbeing service is bursting at the seams. We are dealing with people who experience and are survivors of extreme trauma, and half of those people experience serious suicidal ideation, and that's something that we did not set up to deal with. We thought, as I say, that we were trying to maintain well-being, maintain connections, maintain access to services, and not actually be there as a response that was plugging gaps in services. But unfortunately, that's where we are.
Thank you very much, Ms Burke. My Lord, that may be an appropriate time for our 15-minute break, if that suits your Lordship.
By all means, we'll come back at 1:15. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, my Lord.
Good afternoon.
Thank you.
When you're ready, please just recommence.
Thank you very much, my Lord. Just to remind all of you, we do have a time limit. We do need to finish by 1:30. And just to, something I forgot to mention at the beginning was we do have the roundtable report. So if we don't touch on some of the issues or impacts that are in the report, those will nevertheless be taken into account by the inquiry. So if we do need to skip over one or two of the themes I mentioned earlier, don't be concerned. We do have your comments on those in the form of the roundtable report. The next theme on the agenda is access to food and essential goods. So if I could ask you to outline for His Lordship any particular issues in relation to that, for example, issues with travelling to access food and essential items, lack of support when shopping, issues with online food deliveries, accessibility of rules and signs in shops, accessibility of food banks or community food providers, issues with the provision of food support, access to essential items, including, for example, products, incontinence products and prescriptions, any particular issues for those living in rural areas, any disproportionate impacts on any particular groups of disabled people, or any other relevant key issues or impacts. And I realise we have touched on some of these in some of the other themes already. But if I could ask Mr. Robertson to go first, please, followed by Ms. Burke and then Ms. Scobie.
Thank you. Access to food during the pandemic was incredibly stressful for people with a learning disability. Many of our members require social care support to do a food shop, and suddenly that support was taken away. Support is required to access money, plan and budget the food shop, travel to the shop, and buy what is required. It was challenging to be left without that support. In many ways, our experience of inequality means we have less choice, less options than the rest of society. Living on a limited budget means that it may be necessary for people to travel to places where food is cheaper. The majority of people with a learning disability rely on public transport. The choice to try and avoid places and public transport used by many other people was not possible for us. Other people made use of online food deliveries. This option was often not possible for people with a learning disability for various reasons, including a lack of support to use online services which are often not accessible, and not being able to afford the delivery charge. Members also found it hard to understand the changing rules in supermarkets with signs that were not accessible. Asking for support from supermarket staff was also challenging because of physical distancing rules and not being able to see someone's whole face because of face masks. Overnight, the world became a lot harder to navigate, and cutting off support for people with a learning disability made it even harder. Where support was available for some groups of people, many people with a learning disability either did not meet the criteria for this support, or the information about the support was not accessible to us. Some members turned up at supermarkets during the hour set aside for vulnerable people to shop, but were turned away and told they were not vulnerable. Other members tried to sign up for a priority delivery service for shopping, but again were turned away. The inconsistency of recognising people with a learning disability within vulnerable groups led to confusion, people being excluded from support, and additional services, and the fear of doing the wrong thing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Burke.
I think a lot of what Steve said applied to our members as well, many of whom will have been People First members as well in Glasgow. So the fact that emergency food provision was not always accessible to people, so what was coming through shielding, many people not on the shielding list, how they were put together, those lists wasn't always very clear, and I'm sure it was logical at the start, but maybe needed to be kept under review. Supermarket delivery slots were absolutely overwhelmed. And there was a barrier as well with minimum spend so that people could actually get the delivery without having to pay an exorbitant charge as well. There were proper delays and hurdles and gaps, as I say, with the shielding eligibility and how we could make sure disabled people got that support. And there was a lack of support and negative attitudes faced by people with invisible impairments and conditions or sensory impairments and conditions, and people with learning difficulties as well. There was a specific set of barriers, I think, for disabled people where it wasn't just about food, but it was about vital resources. So things like sanitary products, continence products as well. Those are things that are discreet and sensitive and need to be handled with care. And it was very, very difficult for people to ask for them. So when we were putting our food parcels together, we were bespoking the packages for special diets, for continence products, for sanitary, but even for things like if there were children in the household, to make sure there was fruit, to make sure that there was biscuits and crisps and things, to try and just give a bit of dignity to the families that we were trying to support. Many of these households were individual households, right enough as well, but also barriers to accessing medications and hygiene products. And I know that there were examples of GDA and the staff that we'd engaged to do this actually picking up prescriptions for people and taking them to their houses, as they also did with digital equipment and other bits and pieces as well. I mean, I know that we bought an emergency washing machine for somebody and nobody was delivering to people's houses at that time. So we engaged the services of somebody who was a removal person that we knew. We got the washing machine delivered to him and he delivered it to the house, and he knew a plumber and got it installed and we paid for it. And this was somebody where there was a very unwell person in the house with double incontinence who was receiving palliative care. So we found solutions in a way that maybe big institutions would face more barriers to, but it should never have been that disabled people were so exposed and not having the supports that they needed. And support lines were definitely withdrawn as people were cut off with no support, just like we've said before in relation to social care, in relation to mental health and wellbeing services as well. And I'll stop there in case there's anything Marianne wants to add or expand on.
Thank you very much, Ms. Burke. Ms. Scobie.
Thank you for that. I'm just looking to see what I can add. I don't want to repeat, obviously, in terms of the time scale that we've got. I think what I would add that hasn't been mentioned before is that food banks and other community providers might not have been accessible for disabled people. And again, that's something that we found pre-pandemic in terms of an existing inequality, whereby we are a food bank voucher. We can issue food bank vouchers to disabled people in need, but what we have to do is give people a taxi quite often to the food bank because they can't get there, but also they can't carry the goods from the food bank back home again. So we often have to provide taxis to disabled people in need. That's a pre-pandemic issue. And again, that was an issue that came up and rose during during lockdown. So people who might never have used a food bank before and who had to use a food bank found that they were not necessarily accessible to them. They weren't necessarily given the goods in a dignified way, or thinking about things that, like incontinence products, for example, that Tressa mentioned, or other sort of health related products. So accessing food banks were challenging for a lot of disabled people. because they physically couldn't travel there or couldn't carry the goods. A lot of food that was being provided, such as Meals on Wheels type food, was only being provided by community organisations to older people. So again, as I said previously, a lot of disabled people were not eligible, even if they needed it, even if they were in desperate need, were just turned away because they weren't older people, or they weren't on the shielding list. But there were obviously a lot of younger disabled people who were needing those kind of support and services. The other thing was that many families that we were supporting were larger families with disabled people in the household, and again, a lot of responses weren't necessarily considering the needs of a larger family, or indeed families who might have religious or cultural needs in relation to the food and supplies that they might have needed. We've obviously talked about the shielding list, and we found that for many disabled people, even if they were on the shielding list, that the boxes that were being delivered just weren't suitable for them. I think Tressa mentioned earlier on that they contained a lot of goods such as vegetables that needed to be prepared, and these were to people who particularly those who've had their social care removed or who didn't have other sources of support in the house to be able to make meals. But also they were things that the ordinary folk might not have used. So one member spoke to us about the fact that they'd now stockpiled about a dozen tins of chickpeas and didn't know what to do with them. It wasn't a food that they would normally have eaten before, and they didn't know how to start with things like that. So there was a lot of money. We could see there was a lot of money being spent on responses that actually were completely inappropriate and might have been better spent, again, if disabled people had been involved in the design of those. I think the last thing I would mention that we might have not mentioned before was access to clothing. So for some disabled people, again, access to clothing, and particularly clothing that met your needs as a disabled person, wasn't necessarily something that they could access very easily, either because they were frightened to go out and try clothes on, to actually physically go out to the shops, or they were physically unable to go out to the shops, or they weren't able to access online shopping. And I know in some instances we did provide some clothing for disabled people who were in need because of various circumstances. And one example of that was a disabled person who, at the time, just before lockdown, had gone to another part of the country to visit relatives and ended up stuck there for several weeks without access to clothing. And we were able to support them to be able to access clothing. And I think that the very last point was the fact that a lot of disabled people who live in rural areas in particular were even further disadvantaged because there was less opportunity for them to access local shops, which may not have been accessible to them in the way that non-disabled people would have been able to access, because there were further restrictions in relation to online deliveries in, for example, how far an online supermarket would deliver. A lot of people in rural areas are already disadvantaged, and disadvantaged by the fact that postal charges and delivery charges are much higher if you live in a rural part of Scotland. So they were disadvantaged by not being able to access what they needed locally, but also having to pay more for things to be delivered because they lived in a rural area. So for the first time ever, a lot of people in rural areas might have had to rely on a food bank that they shouldn't have needed to rely on, but it was because of the fact that they were a disabled person living in a rural area. So thank you. That's all I'll add at this point.
Thank you very much, Ms. Scobie. The next theme I have is housing, and I understand that we've touched on some of this already before, and Mr. Robertson, I don't think you have anything to contribute on this particular theme. I think Ms. Burke and Ms. Scobie, if you have anything to add to what you've already said in relation to, for example, accessible housing, moving house, accessible temporary accommodation, withdrawal of social care packages and homelessness, or any other relevant key issues or impacts. I know we've covered some of it already in the discussion, but if there's any other particular key impacts or issues you'd like to flag, I invite you to do so now, and perhaps we can start with Ms. Scobie, followed by Ms. Burke.
Thank you. Thanks so much. I have a few things to add, if that's okay. So again, thinking about in relation to fuel poverty. So a lot of disabled people relied on prepayment meters and didn't have a way to top up their fuel cards or their fuel keys. And again, that might have been because of lack of access to money, but it was also in relation to not being able to physically get out to do that. And again, that's something that we as an organisation ended up having to support people with. In a lot of in rural areas, a lot of people were off the grid, so they had to rely on oil or wood for their heating, and again that was harder to access during lockdown. And just physically, a lot of people were spending a lot more time at home, so needed to be have their house heated and have more electricity on and so on. So fuel poverty increased during lockdown. We had seen a lot of disabled people who needed access to white goods, as Tressa said, in relation to things like washing machines. So access to be able to buy those, to have them delivered, to have them installed, but also the removal of broken goods. We were in touch with several people who'd actually moved house just prior to lockdown, or during some of the lockdown periods where they had difficulty in getting removal companies to support them with moving, but again, getting rid of excess furniture, or someone had moved into a flat which was supposed to be unfurnished but actually had excess furniture in it that they didn't need, and they had a room full of furniture and rubbish that had been left by a previous tenant and couldn't have that anybody to get that removed. There was disabled people, particularly people who live in flats, who are not able to get their rubbish up and down, and normally would have relied on social care, friends and family to be able to take bin bags down to the rubbish, and weren't able to get that. So we had people who had rubbish piling up in their houses. Tressa mentioned the people with continence issues and laundry facilities. One of the other things that we ended up having to support people with was a pick up and drop off laundry service, because they weren't able, again, mainly because of lack of social care or informal support, to be able to support with laundry. As well as the white goods. And then there was also people, and it was one particularly sad story of someone who had an internal bathroom with no window, and the light bulb had gone, and they were basically having to use the bathroom for several weeks before they were in touch with us, because they didn't have a light bulb in the bathroom, and they had no one to be able to change that for them. So again, just simple things like that makes a massive impact on someone's life. Having to use a bathroom in complete darkness in your house, those were the kind of things that people had flagged up, and that wasn't an isolated incident. And the last thing to mention was that the increase in antisocial behaviour from other neighbours, other residents, and no one to support or deal with that or take it seriously. So thank you for that.
Thank you very much, Ms. Scobie. Ms. Burke, do you have anything to add in relation to housing-related issues?
Very quickly, yes. I think the point that Marianne was making about people needing extra support, and we've made the point already about the social care packages being cut. So we had examples of people having to move in with family and the house not being accessible to them. So on one occasion we had to buy 2 portable ramps because of the way the house was structured, so that the person could get in one door. It was in the countryside that she ended up moving to, and had to come out a door and then go round to the other side of the house and get in the back door to get to the toilet. So this is what happens. I mean, the relationship between houses not being accessible and people's social care needs is very high and very interdependent. And so that's something that we would want you to know about. And that's just one example. But the other example I would want to just say is about people who were disabled asylum seekers and refugees. They don't have any involvement, obviously, in the decision about where they'd like to be housed, and people were moved en masse to hostels and hotels. And likewise, homeless people were taken off the street and put into hotels, and this had an impact on disabled people amongst those populations and their access to services and supports that they might have needed as well. So that's just another thing to flag.
Thank you very much, Ms. Burke. The next theme that I have, and I understand again, Mr. Robertson, this is one that you don't wish to contribute to, is impacts on organisations. So if I could perhaps invite Ms. Burke first and Ms. Scobie to highlight for his lordship any particular issues or impacts in relation to your organisation, including, for example, impacts on service delivery by disabled people's organisations, accessibility of pandemic information, the role of disabled people's organisations in providing accessible information, duplication of work, support from disabled people's organisations becoming a first resort, role creep in the provision of welfare assistance, staff and volunteer welfare and well-being, and any other relevant key issues or impacts. And again, just to remind you that we do have the roundtable report, so we will take everything into account. But if there are any particular aspects you'd like to flag, please do so now. So perhaps we can start with Ms Burke and followed by Ms Scobie.
Thanks very much. Yeah, so I think the impacts on organisations where, first of all, being disabled people ourselves, there was a great drive for us to be able to meet disabled people's needs and really make sure that people did not fall through the gaps, which we know they always do. We were absolutely determined at Glasgow Disability Alliance, but across the DPO movement, which is a very small and fragile ecosystem in Scotland, partly fragile because of funding, but also because we're all disabled people ourselves, often with illnesses or conditions where we face illness, but we also face a lot of barriers in our lives as well. But we were absolutely determined to do our best. So that's the first thing to say, that kind of pressure that we felt. We, I think, all went above and beyond in trying to meet need. At first, the support from government was fantastic in that they engaged with us right away. They wanted to know what we were hearing on the cutting edge, on the ground, what was the grassroots experience. They wanted to give us COVID grants, and money came from the UK government via the Scottish government to do that, and we accessed other funding as well as repurposing our own funding. So we were in a really great position to be able to meet needs and set up innovative and responsive supports that disabled people needed. I think I would want you to know that we were a lifeline to disabled people at that time, literally, I think, saving lives, if that's not too dramatic, but unfortunately it is true. But the thing that I feel really desperately annoyed about is that we have not learned lessons, and that a lot of the supports that were needed at that time and the ways of doing things, which were about being flexible, about trusting disabled people's organisations and about letting us get on with the business of meeting the needs and working with our people, have been eroded. And it is much harder for us. I mean, we've been trying, myself and Marianne and the other DPOs, to desperately to keep the money that we need to be able to provide, particularly in GDA, the wellbeing supports, because that hasn't gone away. That's got worse, and the census backs that up. We know the data and evidence backs that up, that people's wellbeing and mental health is so severely compromised, and yet we're really struggling to keep our wellbeing service going. We're struggling to keep our digital service going. It's as though everything's been solved overnight, but actually it hasn't. It's just that good things happened as a result of COVID, if you can see a silver lining, but they have not been maintained, and we have really been trying so desperately hard and killing ourselves in the process, and that has an impact on workload, it has an impact on well-being, but that precarity and that uncertainty and instability has an impact not just on our staff, who are mainly disabled people with a whole range of impairments, but on our members, who are so desperately relying on the services and supports that we provide, which unfortunately are not what we wanted to do. We did not want to provide services and supports. It's not what we did when we set up. It was all about reducing isolation and loneliness. It was all about building the collective voice of disabled people. But it has turned into plugging gaps in services, as well as those other vital things that we continue to do. So those are the key things that I would want to emphasise, being aware of time.
Thank you very much. Ms Scobie, do you have anything to add to what Ms Burke said about impacts on the organisations?
Yeah, of course. I think we have to recognise that some smaller organisations had to close down, and some have never reopened since the pandemic began, because of how they delivered their services, and they weren't possible to change and innovate. We were fortunate in the fact that we were supported to do that by the government and by our funders. I think that we've already talked about quite a few things. I think one of the things that was really helpful for us as an organisation and for the other DPOs was that we were involved in some government planning groups to be able to think about what pandemic responses needed to happen. So there was a lot of very sort of fast, rapid groups that came on board. One example was the inclusive vaccination programme. So the government wanted to make sure that the rollout of the vaccination programme would be as accessible as possible. And obviously being part of that group as our organisation was, we were able to flag up ideas around how to make it more accessible. We were able to give live intel into examples as to where it wasn't being done as it was intended. One example was the fact that I knew, because it was myself who was on this group, that there was an intention that if a disabled person turned up with a carer, with a carer, that the carer would be automatically vaccinated at the same time as the disabled person. That decision was something that we'd pushed for. That was made as a decision. But then we found out that in quite a few instances that carers were not being vaccinated alongside the disabled person that they'd had to bring, and that had a huge impact on people who, for example, lived in a say a husband and wife living in the same home, where one was the carer for the other. It meant that when the carer had to go and get their vaccination, the disabled person had to go again. So that was 2 trips out of the house that were not necessary for the carer and the disabled person. And there was lots of sort of very practical things that we were able to put forward on that group and on other groups in relation to some of the rollout. I think that in terms of the workloads of the organisation, the workload increased massively in relation to our organisation. We could easily have just down tools and done nothing, but again, because we're a disabled people's organisation, because more than half of our team are disabled people, and more than half of those are people who ended up who are extremely clinically vulnerable and would be shielding, we felt that it was our duty to do as much as we could for disabled people. But the pressure on us and the workload on the staff increased dramatically at that time, and in fact our staff team trebled, from about 15 people to around 40 people within a few months, because we had so much additional work to do and so much additional things that we were doing to support disabled people. So there was a lot of additional pressure on us as senior people within the organisation to be supporting and leading that new staff team, and doing that from a distance. And as an organisation, we were partly set up to do that because we do support disabled people. So some of us were already geared up to be working from home, because it enabled us to continue to work at times when we were unable to be in the office. So we had some indication and some experience of doing that, but we then had to do that for all of our staff team, and then to recruit and support new staff during that time. So that was a huge impact on the organisation and on the welfare of the staff and the people that we were supporting as well, and thinking about their capacity to make sure that there was no burnout and so on and so forth. We again had to support a lot of our partners, because they weren't experienced in supporting disabled people remotely. So as I mentioned earlier on, supporting some of our partners and some of our tutors, some of the people who deliver to disabled people, supporting them to be more tech savvy in relation to how to deliver things online and to how to support people online. Sorry, I'm just having a wee. I think the other impact on the organisation for us as a disabled people's organisation, and we were providing vital life-saving work to disabled people, is that our staff team initially were not regarded as key workers in the way that health and social care staff were regarded as key workers. So we didn't necessarily have access to vaccinations for the non-disabled staff who were key workers. They weren't necessarily able to access some of the support, such as being able to get access to supermarkets to do shopping for people and so forth. So it did take us a little bit of time to be able to get the recognition for disabled people's organisations, staff members to be regarded as key workers. So that was our personal assistants, our support staff, and indeed our key staff who were delivering some of those services, vital services for disabled people, to be recognised as key workers. I think that's everything that I've got noted here that I'd like to add at this point. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Scobie. the penultimate topic is ongoing impacts. If I could invite you, please, Mr. Robertson, to start by highlighting for his lordship any particular issues in relation to ongoing impacts, for example, whether some disabled people remain vulnerable to the COVID-19 virus and the extent to which the pandemic is over for them, and any other relevant key ongoing impacts or issues not already covered. And if we could start with you, Mr. Robertson.
Thank you. The cutting of support continues to this day. Local authorities used the pandemic as an excuse. They told us we coped okay then and we can cope okay now. This is not true, and many of us are still struggling every day. Complex new processes and systems for accessing healthcare have remained, and many of members report that it is impossible to get a GP appointment. Phoning at a specific time, having to explain symptoms over the phone to reception staff who do not understand learning disability, being offered a phone call appointment and having to be available for a whole day waiting for the call, not knowing how to call back if you miss it. These are all things that make the process inaccessible for us. COVID vaccine appointments that can only be changed online are a further barrier that have caused significant stress for members this winter. The increased barriers to accessing healthcare during and since the pandemic mean that members have experienced a deterioration in their health. We have sadly seen an increase in members who have passed away since the pandemic. The ongoing impacts are so wide and numerous that it is hard to explain fully. It's hard to fully explain them, and there is no research into it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Robertson. If I can invite Ms. Burke, followed by Ms. Scobie.
Thank you. Yeah. I think everything that Steve said we would absolutely agree with. The ongoing impacts for disabled people are the supercharged inequalities and exclusion, the fact that people have been experiencing even more health inequalities now. It definitely is leading to sooner deaths. We have lost hundreds and hundreds of members of Glasgow Disability Alliance, and it's not always coming to us in real time when that's happened. So I gave a report last November when I gave evidence in 2023 to the inquiry, and there are another couple of hundred since then. So we can't be sure when people died because it's not always reported at the time. And we know that a lot of that is COVID, but some of that, quite a bit, is health inequalities as well. So there is that ongoing inequality and that ongoing devastating impact. There is also the group of people who we've uncovered who were dealing with such a lot of either social anxiety or a lack of practical support. So people who need social care but for whatever reason aren't able to access it, either because thresholds are so high or because they can't have social care because maybe they can't afford the charges. We're not 100% sure, but for whatever reason, they are so excluded and stuck at home that they really, really need that online support that we're providing. But one of the impacts on us is that we are having moved everything online during 2020 and continue to provide it, then having gone back to in-person as well. We are now trying to do two things with the same amount or less money, and it is just so very, very stressful. But again, that moral kind of ethical pressure to be able to continue to deliver and support people is very much with us because we are disabled people ourselves and we want to be able to provide that. But that cohort of people are still very much in need. And then there is another group of people who are extremely clinically vulnerable, and they're excluded, and they are an organised movement of people, and I know they engage with the inquiry, and they're engaging with health, and they're engaging with the government as well about the fact that the vaccines don't offer them protection, but with all the public health protection measures being taken away, it leaves them very vulnerable, and COVID hasn't gone away. I mean, another impact for us is that, you know, there is still a misunderstanding or a confusion, I think it is, about why some people are getting access to the vaccines and the boosters and some people aren't. So people who are on certain drugs are getting it, but people who are on similar drugs aren't getting it. We just don't understand how that can be. So there's a bit of confusion. It's difficult for us to translate that into accessible information because we don't understand it ourselves, despite Marianne sitting in the vaccine steering group that she was mentioning there. So there's still a lot of ongoing inequalities. And I would say for the organisations trying to plug all those gaps, we are disadvantaged because we're disabled people ourselves, and the barriers and just the understanding of the inequalities disabled people face, that just is not there. And so funders and governments don't understand that maybe we need to be protected in order to keep those lifeline services going. But that's a separate point.
Thank you very much, Ms Burke. Ms Scobie, do you have anything to add in relation to ongoing impacts? And just to remind you that we have, I think, 9 minutes left, and I'd still like to give you all an opportunity to address us on potential lessons learned. But Ms Scobie, if you have anything to add in relation
just one thing to add, because Steve and Tressa have covered everything, is that the ongoing public perceptions, reactions, hostility and hate crime that disabled people are facing, and sometimes that has been exacerbated and continues because, for example, some people when they go out wish to continue to wear face coverings, for example, and you know all the sort of hostile and harmful messaging around the fact that 60% of disabled people died, but you know it was people with pre-existing health conditions. So non-disabled healthy people think that, you know, that they have nothing to fear, so they're going back to living their lives in the way that, you know, they used to before, with no consideration for disabled people and what you know, the impacts, the continued impacts on their life. So that all of that adds to the ongoing hostility that disabled people are facing just out there. I think that the public perception of disabled people has gone down and has continued to decrease, which results in increased hostility and hate crime that disabled people are facing. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Scobie. The final theme is potential lessons to be learned. So, based on the experience of your organisations during the pandemic, I'd invite you to provide suggestions to His Lordship for what the Scottish Government could do to mitigate ongoing impacts of the strategic response to the pandemic, or could do differently to improve matters in the event of another pandemic or other similar emergency. And if I can invite Mr Robertson to start, followed by Ms Scobie and finally Ms Burke.
Thank you. We have described how people with a learning disability experience extreme discrimination and prejudice. We do not get the support we need to live a life like other citizens. So we were on an unequal footing from the beginning, and decisions taken during the pandemic further contributed to our unequal life experience. To address this, the government need to fully realise our human rights, and we would then be in an equal position if an emergency like this happened again. Meet our rights in the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. In particular, the right to independent living and the right to make decisions. Equal status in society would mean our lives are valued and we are not seen as expendable. We want to see a duty on public bodies to comply with the rights in the Convention. We need to see urgent action on getting people with a learning disability out of hospital. The Coming Home commitment to significantly reduce the number of people with a learning disability by March 2024 has not been met. No person with a learning disability should be in hospital because of a failure to support them in the community. This is an abuse of human rights, and those citizens would be further put at risk if another pandemic happened. Involve people with a learning disability fully in the planning for emergencies like the pandemic, and please act on what we say. Understand that providing social care support is not optional. It should never be seen as something that can be taken away. It is an essential tool in life to meet our human rights. All of this can only happen if we are fully involved in decision-making processes about our lives. This means funding DPOs, including the ones here today, to continue supporting and empowering disabled people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Robertson. Ms. Scobie.
Thank you. I think we've said at several points in the day that had disabled people and our organisations been involved, some of these issues would not have arisen in the first place. So the Scottish Government and other public services need to prioritise actions to include disabled people in pandemic and other disaster planning, and just ongoing planning of all services and supports that they have responsibility for. I absolutely echo everything that Steve's just said. We also need to look at prioritising actions around disabled people's poverty and inequality more generally. We've obviously been working with the Scottish Government recently in relation to a disability equality plan, and that would be something that we would absolutely see as essential to prevent anything like this ever happening again. If we'd been involved in the planning, some of the impacts might never have happened, and those and others would have been mitigated at a shorter in a shorter time and point. We need the long-term investment and funding and resourcing of disabled people's organisations to be able to facilitate that. And we need the Scottish Government to trust us as organisations. It was very clear that, from mid-March 2020 to, for quite some time, the Scottish Government and other major funders just trusted us to do the right thing with their money to support disabled people. And as Tressa mentioned earlier on, that's all been retrenched and basically has gone back to over scrutiny and over scrutiny of what we do, but also more and more difficult to actually secure resources in the first place. So we need to be able to be trusted to just do the right thing and to use our experience as disabled people and disabled people's organisations to support disabled people. And we always say that if you support disabled people and if you make it right for disabled people, you make it right for everyone. No one's going to be disadvantaged by making the world a better place and a more equal place for disabled people. So there needs to be investment across all public services, but particularly within health and social care. And as Steve said, social care is essential for disabled people to be able to live their lives like any other citizen and to meet our human rights. I'll pass over to Tressa to
Thank
finish
you, Ms.
off.
Ms. Burke.
Thanks very much. Just to add to what's been said, all of the above that Marianne has just said there, and what Steve has said as well. And I think with an emphasis on the funding and resourcing and the investment of DPOs, disabled people-led organisations, because we are uniquely placed to tell disabled people what their rights are, help them claim them, learn about them, campaign for them, try and access them, but also to think about what the remedy is when those things aren't delivered. So I think that's really important. The investment in public services, particularly health and social care, yes, but we do need to look at affordability, and we do need to look at taxation, and particularly progressive taxation. And I know the Scottish Government is looking at that. We need to step that up. We need to be talking to the UK Government about how we can do that and work together and do it better, because we don't have all the powers in Scotland that we would need, but we absolutely do need to do that, and we need to involve disabled people and our organisations in those things. I think the action plan that Marianne spoke about is absolutely right. We need to get actions, get resources, which have been mentioned in the most recent budget, so we're very heartened by that, for the action plan. we need to make sure that those are targeted to disabled people so that we can start getting money into their pockets, getting services that they need, and to make their lives better. And as Steve says, to get some rights around Article 19 in the UNCRPD and all of the rights that disabled people have to be better realised. But the last thing I would want to say is that I think there needs to be a shared accountability and a shared responsibility for disabled people's human rights, so that we are no longer and never again left behind, not just to die, but to live lives of inequality and health inequalities for longer. There was a book recently launched called Social Murder, and it's about the conditions that have been created and a direct and causal connection between austerity and early death. It's been written by Professor Jerry McCartney and Dr. David Walsh at Glasgow University, looking at that, and they have evidenced this connection. So what we need to do is, as a nation, as institutions, as communities, to take collective responsibility and individual responsibility so that disabled people become valued and not left behind in society, left behind to die in higher numbers, but also to live lives of more inequalities for longer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms Burke, and thank you to all the panel members this afternoon. My Lord, I don't have any further questions for this panel unless your Lordship does.
No, I have no questions to ask. Just thank the participants for their attendance here today in person or online. That's all. I think that formally closes the evidential part of the hearings, and we're now going to ask the participants to leave before we hear some closing remarks by you, Ms. Howden.
Thank you, my Lord, and I won't be long, so thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, my Lord. My Lord, that concludes the oral impact evidence relating to business and welfare. As I mentioned in my opening statement, the impact evidence that we've heard during the course of these hearings, as well as the rest of the impact evidence that the portfolio team has been gathering in the form of 53 witness statements, 64 responses to requests for information under Rule 8, and the reports of 27 roundtable discussions will form the basis of a narrative record of the impact evidence relating to business and welfare. That record will highlight the key issues and impacts that have been identified and is due to be published during the course of 2025. As I also mentioned at the preliminary hearing, my Lord, your Lordship has issued a direction in relation to closing statements for this set of hearings, in terms of which core participants with leave to appear may, if they so wish, submit a written closing statement to the inquiry. That is to be by no later than 12 noon on the 29th of January 2025, is to be no longer than 2,500 words, and should have regard to the terms of appendix to that direction. Finally, my Lord, on behalf of the portfolio team and the inquiry, I'd like to again thank those core participants and non-core participants who've generously given their time to assist the inquiry with its investigations into the impacts relating to business and welfare through their engagement both with the legal team and with Let's Be Heard. The useful information that we've received in relation to impacts will continue to inform our ongoing investigations into implementation and decision-making. Unless I can be of further assistance, my Lord, that concludes these impact hearings from Council's perspective.
Not at all. Thank you very much indeed, Ms. van der Westhuizen. Can I thank you, as I did before the first part of these hearings finished 3 or 4 weeks ago. Thank you for the punctual and expeditious delivery of the evidence. I'm delighted to say that we managed to get through on time, all the time, and enable us to finish these hearings before the festive season commences. So can I thank you again, but can I ask you please to pass on my thanks to your colleagues and assistants, Mr. Turner, Mr. Stephen and Ms. Stewart, for their valuable efforts in this joint venture. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, my Lord.